race. We've, in addition to that, seen well-known Democratic donors saying that they would like to see someone other than President Biden as the standard bearer for the Democrats in November. All of that pressure was starting to really weigh on President Biden. The latest Democrat being Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. Earlier today, he called on President Biden to bow out. And that's just what's been happening publicly. Behind the scenes, some very well-known Democrats, the leaders of the party, former President Barack Obama, former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, the leader for Democrats in the Senate, Hakeem Jeffries, the leader for Democrats in the House, all of them in private conversations, we're telling President Biden, we really respect you. We respect what you've done, but we do not believe that you can beat Donald Trump in November. And we are not only concerned about that, we are concerned as well about you being a drag on the Democratic ticket for the down ballot races that will take place, which will make us so difficult for Democrats to take back the House of Representatives and to hold on to the U.S. Senate.
And John, I know we talked earlier today about momentum. While the Democrats have been in disarray, especially since that debate, Republicans have been speeding ahead, and even more so after the RNC, which you were at. Can they be caught? What's it going to take, to catch up to them, and who might need to be on a ticket, whether the president or vice president, to do so?
Well, the bottom line, Ryan, is that Democrats need to quickly come together and coalesce around Kamala Harris. They need to put their differences aside. They need to unite in the same way that we saw Republicans unite this past week in Milwaukee. As you point out, I was at the RNC. It was a very united convention, a very united party. They're jubilant, they're energized, they're confident. Democrats are not in the same position right now. If you look at the calendar right now, there are 107 days between now and the November 5th election. That time will fly by. And as you point out, Rashida, just 3 weeks between now and the Democratic National Convention. So there's a lot of work that needs to take place over the course of the next 3 weeks so that there is not any type of division that takes place during the 4 days of the DNC in Chicago.
And John, I know I always rely on you to be our historian of sorts. You've been covering the White House since the Clinton administration. This topsy-turvy election cycle, talk about, has there been anything like it? I mean, it's literally week to week, day to day, really. It's something new, and we forget about what happened yesterday because there's something else on the horizon.
Well, there have been election cycles that have had surprises before. 1972, one of the candidates running for president in 1972, former Alabama Governor George Wallace, was an individual who survived an assassination attempt. 1968, Robert F. Kennedy Sr. Was killed in an assassination. And that obviously had an impact on the 1968 election cycle. But we have never seen anything like this. We've never seen the presumptive nominee for a major party drop out of the race with less than 4 months to go until Election Day. This is unprecedented, and I think all of this stems from that disastrous debate performance that President Biden undertook last month. That has led to the cascading of all of these events over the course of the past few weeks, culminating in this remarkable decision by President Biden to announce that he is not going to go forward with his quest for re-election. He's dropping out of the race, and he's throwing his support to his Vice President Kamala Harris to be the Democratic nominee this November.
All right. The other question I have is that, throughout the weekend, I remember AOC came out saying, a lot of people might be surprised that a lot of Democrats may not stand behind Kamala Harris. Is it likely that the Democratic Party can get it together to maybe champion behind Kamala Harris? Some people are throwing out some other names out there. We've seen the polls say, in some cases, of course, she hasn't publicly said that she is running, that Michelle Obama is the only person that could potentially beat Donald Trump. But Kamala Harris's name is who's at the top of that list. Is it likely that Democrats are going to get it together in the next few weeks and get behind Vice President Kamala Harris?
Rashida, I am not a fortune teller. I can't say with certainty what's going to happen over the course of the next few weeks, but I can say that it matters a lot that President Biden, in that note that he put out earlier today, and in the statement that former President Bill Clinton put out earlier today, they endorsed Kamala Harris. That goes a long way. And I think that what you're going to see happen over the course of the next 24, 48 hours is that other Democrats will fall in line. They will unite around the sitting vice president, including progressives like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the person that you mentioned, who is a leader in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. They have no choice. They cannot afford to have a fight. They cannot afford to be disunified going into their convention. And that's the reason why I believe that the sitting vice president, Kamala Harris, will indeed be at the top of the ticket in November. And the real question that we'll have to figure out, and Democrats, more importantly, will have to figure out over the course of the next week and perhaps weeks, is who will be her running mate, who will be the best person to not only unify the Democratic Party, but to win specific states to help in that effort to beat Donald Trump in November.
Not a fortune teller, just our White House correspondent, John Decker. Thanks again for tuning in and enlightening us with all your insight and expertise.
Thank you.
And so here's part of the statement from the Trump campaign. I know we're getting reaction on both sides of it here as we recap and reset that, current President Joe Biden says he's not running for re-election in 2024. We've been talking to a lot of people about what this means next, talking to a lot of people about how they feel, especially members of the GOP. They have a lot to say about what's going on in the Democratic Party right now.
Yeah, let's go ahead and turn now to part of a statement from the Trump campaign. They have reacted to this news of President Biden saying he is stepping out of the race. They say Joe Biden cannot take himself out of a campaign for president because he is too mentally incompetent and still remains in the White House. Biden is a national security threat in great cognitive decline and a clear and present danger to every man, woman, and child in our country. The question then to Kamala Harris is simple. Knowing that Joe Biden withdrew from the campaign because of his rapidly deteriorating condition, does Harris believe the people of America are safe and secure with Joe Biden in the White House for the next 6 months? And as you just heard that, I mean, you have to think he is still the current president,
Yes.
even though he's deciding that, he just can't take it for another 4 years. It doesn't mean that he can't finish out his job. He has said that in that interview with with ABC correspondent George Stephanopoulos shortly after that disastrous CNN presidential debate. He said that he can still continue to serve, that he wanted to serve, and that the only way he was going to step down is if God himself came down and said, hey, I want you out of the race. But here we are, a couple weeks later, and we're talking about President Biden stepping aside. A lot of his colleagues in the Democratic Party saying that this is just a show of his patriotism. This is something that he's done his entire life. We know he was once a senator. Now the president of the United States, was formerly the vice president under the Obama administration. And we're continuing to get a little bit more information from the Democratic side, and we want to read you a couple of new statements, one of them being from Senator Peter Welch of Vermont. He's a Democrat. He issued this statement saying, today Joe Biden made a difficult and selfless choice. There you hear it again, saying selfless. He put our democracy and the future of our nation ahead of himself. For this and for all he has done, Joe Biden will be remembered as one of the greatest presidents of our time. His agenda, which has unified our party, will be his legacy. His ability to overcome personal tragedy has inspired generations of Americans. That again from Senator Peter Welch
And we
of
know,
Vermont.
a lot of people want to see Joe Biden jump into the race in 2016 when it was Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
Talking about some of the tragedy he's experienced. We know Joe Biden lost a wife and a daughter years ago when he was senator. He lost his son, Beau Biden, when he was still vice president as well. One of the reasons that it's been reportedly told told why he was kind of told, hey, take time for your family, grieve some. That's why Hillary Clinton took the nomination in 2016. So interesting that he relied on some of that right there too.
Yeah.
But it's obviously just an interesting time. We heard from John right there saying, hey, Democrats are going to need to unify, going to need to get together, going to need to come together in the next 3 weeks, especially by the end of that DNC, so voters have a clear picture of who the nominee is, what they stand for, and if they feel confident that they can lead the country, obviously lead the party, and either keep the White House in a Democratic name. So,
all right, and we know how important family is to the Biden family and the Biden administration. Let's turn now to author and Professor Emeritus at American University, W. Joseph Campbell. Thank you so much for joining us. I mean, a stunning decision by President Biden today. What's your reaction to today's news?
Yeah, it was stunning in terms of its timing. I think it was probably an inevitable decision given Biden's really disastrous performance 3.5 weeks ago at the debate with Donald Trump. And I think it became inevitable from what we saw at that debate and what we saw even before of Joe Biden's infirmities, that there is no way he could stay in the race and continue to be the Democratic standard bearer. And so I think this is an inevitable decision. And if one were really getting kind of harsh about it, it was a little selfish because 3.5 weeks have gone by, and those have been 3.5 tumultuous weeks that have left the Democratic Party in disarray. And we're also in uncharted territory right now, to invoke a political cliche, because Lyndon Johnson was the last sitting president to announce that he was not going to run for re-election. And that was in 1968, in March of 1968. So here we are in almost the end of July 2024, and we're less than 4 months from a general election. So it is really uncertain as to how all this is going to unfold over the next several weeks. It looks like Kamala Harris is probably going to be the odds-on favorite to become the Democratic nominee, but even that may be up in the air for some question.
Time is of the essence. Questions coming in quickly, and you've written about the challenges in political polling, and polls were likely a big factor in today's decision. What were they saying about Biden's chances in November, and where do things stand now for Kamala Harris as it pertains to the numbers?
You're right about the polls. They were certainly an important point in Biden's making this decision, this belated decision to drop out of the race. The polls have been saying in recent weeks that Joe Biden trails Donald Trump clearly, but not in a dramatic way. We're not talking about an 8, 10 point, 12 point deficit here. We're talking something on the order of 2, 4, 6 points in various polls. So that's not a terrible or insurmountable deficit for an incumbent president, certainly, to try to overcome, especially a candidate like Donald Trump, who has his problems too. And Trump just doesn't seem to be able to keep out of his own way in many respects. So this is more likely to be a close race than a landslide. And there has been some talk about if Biden stays in the race, Trump will win in a landslide. Even if that had been the scenario, I don't think Trump would have prevailed in a landslide. So I think it's probably even more unlikely, if you will, now that Trump will have a huge lead in the polls come Labor Day, say.
Yeah, we've seen Donald Trump and his campaign come out and kind of attack Kamala Harris, saying that she knew about his decline leading up into this point of him stepping aside. Now, Kamala Harris has not been nominated just yet. What do you think of her chances in November, and who are some other candidates the party could consider? Because, again, she is not the official nominee. We have to wait until the Democratic National Convention. That's
for sure. Democrats do, though, have a way of nominating former vice presidents for their presidential candidates. And we can go back to 1968 when Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, took over the nomination from Lyndon Johnson. Al Gore in the year 2000, and Joe Biden himself was a former vice president. So we've seen vice presidential candidates become or graduate up to, if you will, the presidential slot on the Democratic tickets. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's the way this all shakes out. It'd probably be the most elegant solution, if you will, the easiest to reach. But other candidates are probably out there. And Gavin Newsom of California, the governor of California, is certainly among them.
And you wrote a recent op-ed about Donald Trump and his prediction for a landslide. Thoughts still the same, or have they changed now in light of this announcement this afternoon?
I appreciate the question. It's a good question. I do think it's still the same. I think that Donald Trump's winning in a landslide is still unlikely, and we'll have to see what the polls are showing over the next 10 days or so. And but I don't think that they're going to show that the Democratic candidates or the Democratic hopefuls have cratered vis-a-vis Donald Trump in terms of polling data. I just don't see that. And Trump may be forging ahead in key battleground states, of which there are 6 or 7, depending on how you want to count them. But they include Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, maybe North Carolina, Georgia for sure, Arizona, and Nevada. And Trump, as of now, seems to have a pretty solid lead in most of those states. And those are key states, especially the northern tier states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania for the Democrats. To win those, to be able to nail down an electoral college victory. So it remains to be seen whether Kamala Harris or whoever the successor is to Biden, the presumed nominee, is going to be. It's going to be difficult to see how they're going to be able to put together an electoral college combination that brings them over the top. It's still tough to see that.
Yeah, what's interesting is that, earlier we read that that statement from the Trump administration saying that, kind of pivoting their focus onto Kamala Harris. They now have a few months to start to raise money and make ads that are targeted towards Kamala Harris. And it seems like they're going in the direction of saying, hey, these are the things that the Biden-Harris administration did. How do you think it's going to kind of play out in terms of them being able to find some of the things that Biden may have done or the administration has done and kind of put the blame on Kamala Harris? Do you think there's enough time to shift their focus onto Kamala Harris? Is it going to be easier because she was already on that ticket?
That's right. She's been in the administration, and one would argue, has a lot to answer for in terms of the administration's policies and decision-making, especially since Biden had named her the lead, if you will, on the southern border. And that's one of the Republicans' major talking points is how the southern border is essentially wide open. And there have been 10 million to 13 million people who've made their way into the United States unvetted and improperly. So I think that that's going to be a major talking point. It would have been a major talking point had Biden stayed at the top of the ticket. But now that Kamala Harris may well be at the top of the ticket, that is certainly an argument that Republicans are going to be making about her. And I think they're going to know, too, that she did not do terribly well in the primary season in the 2020 election cycle. She dropped out before even the first primary, or maybe right after the first primary in 2020. And so I don't know. Her national political standing doesn't seem to be terribly strong. But we'll see if indeed she is the nominee and if indeed she grows into the position. But time is tight. Time is really, really tight here.
Yeah, time is of the essence. I think this is one of the first times, at least in our recent years, in which this has kind of been, like Ryan mentioned, a topsy-turvy election. And we have a couple more weeks to figure out what Democrats are going to do. Author, professor at American University, W. Joseph Campbell, thank you so much for joining us here on Local News Live and giving us some valuable insight.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Now, obviously, to recap, we're going over the breaking news that came down this afternoon, about 1:45-ish. President Joe Biden announcing on social media that he is bowing out of the 2024 election. He's obviously given his endorsement to Kamala Harris. That's why we're giving her so much talk. Other names could throw their names in the hat as well. At the DNC, could be an open convention, quote unquote, as Josh Rotenberg said. That's how they used to do it in the old days, where nominees would come in and have to vie and really plead their case for why they should get the delegates' vote and the delegates' attention. So that's one thing we're going to be interested to see. We're still going to wait and hear more. We've already heard from the DNC. They haven't indicated exactly what direction it's going. They just said, thank you, Joe Biden, and left it in ellipses, ... So we're still trying to figure out exactly what's next and what we can go from here. But I know we're getting some other statements here from Barack Obama, another former president, powerful voice in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, this is what he had to say. He says, for him to look at the political landscape, referring to Biden, and decide that he should pass the torch to a new nominee is surely one of the toughest in his life, but I know he wouldn't make the decision unless he believed it was right for America. It's a testament to Joe Biden's love of our country, a historic example of genuine public servant once again putting the interests of the American people ahead of his own, that future generations of leaders will do and will eventually follow. That is from the former President Barack Obama, his former boss. It's interesting to see so many Democrats coming forward, giving their statements, and they have all said he is putting service over anything else, over his personal ambitions, even though despite over the weeks, many Democrats, top officials have come forward and say, it's time, Joe, to step aside. And he's ignored some of those calls. But it seems like, you know, he got COVID earlier this week. Not sure if that had an impact on his vulnerability, and just seeing that, you know, maybe his health isn't in as good of a position as it is to continue for another 4 years. You have to think these presidents, they travel for weeks at a time. They're in Italy one day, they're back in the United States. And to do that at the age of 81, I mean, it's difficult.
And it's worth noting, too, former President Donald Trump, 78 years old, so not much farther behind him when it comes to the calendar. But, you know, back in February, we talk a lot about Kamala Harris. I spoke with her then purely as a vice president on the ticket. Now she could be a nominee for the president. I spoke with her and I asked her, you know, hey, if Joe Biden were to step aside for whatever reason, you know, are you ready to step in and fill the reins and take control? Here's what she said.
I think one of the concerns that Americans have about the age is just older people have, you know, more health issues. It's a real thing. What do you say to those concerns? And specifically, if he had to pass the powers to you for 1 second, 1 minute, heaven forbid, and you know, I ask with all due respect, but you know, are you capable? Are you ready to step into the role and do whatever the country would need?
Absolutely ready.
And that's Vice President Kamala Harris right there. We touched on a number of things, specifically, you know, what her record on the border was. She talked a lot about women's reproductive rights, two critical issues that are on the ballot this year, especially when we look at, you know, both sides of the equation. You know, immigration's a topic on both, a bipartisan issue amongst voters. You know, reproductive women's rights, a bipartisan issue, whether you're on one side of it or the other. A lot of voters wanting to come out. But, you know, specifically, is Kamala Harris going to give them a reason to come out? You know, the vice president obviously was already on the ticket, but President Joe Biden, you know, obviously losing support en masse by the hour, it seemed like. So, you know, is Vice President Kamala Harris able to pick that up and catch up to the Republicans who are, you know, full steam ahead after that RNC?
Yeah, it's interesting to see, you know, even maybe a couple weeks ago, they spoke, I remember CNN spoke to Nancy Pelosi, and they asked her, do you support President Biden? Do you endorse him? And she said, I want him to do whatever he feels is best. She would never publicly say it, but we know now that she has had private talks. The two have been friends for years, and I think that kind of shows the kind of weight maybe that Nancy Pelosi still has in the Democratic Party for him to listen, and maybe listen to some of the calls of some of his other colleagues to step aside. Despite his pride, we know President Biden is a prideful man, so for him to step aside, he had to have thought that this was the absolute best option, and for him to endorse Kamala Harris, he has to think she's the best option for president. Yeah,
and it wasn't just Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi. It was former President Barack Obama. We know he met with President Joe Biden. Majority Leader in the Senate, Chuck Schumer, met with him. Minority Leader of the House, Hakeem Jeffries, met with him. One thing we took away from a lot of those conversations was that they never gave President Biden an endorsement during those critical conversations, as we know, as they were not necessarily asking him to step aside, but they were hashing out a lot of the concerns that many people in their delegation, whether the Senate or the House, had about him. Because we know it's not just about the White House. Right. It's about down ticket as well. The House, a lot of critical battles going to be had across the nation. And if you're weak at the top, not good for the bottom of the ticket as well. The Senate, it is basically tied. The only reason that Chuck Schumer is in the majority is because they have the White House, and Vice President Kamala Harris is a record, is a tie-breaking vote of sorts. You know, that's her job to do. So, you know, if you lose one seat in the Senate, you could be done there too. It's a lot of bad news coming down. So that's why a lot of people were urging the White House to, not the White House, but President Joe Biden to please step aside so we can continue to remain control and win, so that way these GOP policies don't take over.
And we know how critical it is for Congress. We've seen potential shutdowns looming. We've seen how difficult it's been for them to get bills passed. We've also seen how heavy Trump still has a hand, and there's some bills that were supposed to be passed, and President Trump said don't pass it, and Republicans all of a sudden decided that they did not want to pass that border bill. And so it's interesting to see how so many Senate Democrats, House Democrats, they're all very worried about their seats. Of course, they are the lawmakers of this country, so they want to get the bills passed that they can for their states, for the country altogether.
Yeah, it's going to be a battle. And, Republicans know how important these battles are, too. We know former President Donald Trump, obviously, who is going to be going up against whoever's at the top of the Democratic ticket. He's been weighing in a lot, and it seems like every statement he releases gets more and more, energizing or vigorous, so to speak. He says Joe Biden can't take himself out of a campaign for president because he is too mentally incompetent and still remain in the White House. Biden is a national security threat in great cognitive decline and a clear and present danger to every man, woman, and child in our country. The question then to Kamala Harris is simple. Knowing that Joe Biden withdrew from the campaign because of his rapidly deteriorating condition, does Harris believe the people of America are safe and secure with Joe Biden in the White House for 6 more months? We've heard a lot of rhetoric from them, and we know Donald Trump not the only one talking today.
Yeah, we know Republicans are coming forward, giving their statements. House Speaker Mike Johnson responding today, saying in part, quote, having invalidated the votes for more than 14 million Americans who selected Joe Biden to be the Democratic nominee for president, the self-proclaimed party of democracy has proven exactly the opposite. The party's prospects are no better now with Vice President Kamala Harris, who co-owns the disastrous policy failures of the Biden administration. As second in command and the completely inept border czar, Harris has been a gleeful accomplice, not only in the destruction of American sovereignty, security, and prosperity, but also in the largest political cover-up in United States history. She is known for as long as anyone of his incapacity to serve. This is something that a lot of Republicans are saying. Why now? Why are you just now, weeks before the Democratic National Convention, coming forward? You've had many talks with the president. Most times, I'm sure every day, she sees him. She's on the campaign trail. And she always champions him. So a lot of Republicans are going to have a lot to say. They're going to be critical of her, of the policies under Biden. So the thing about Kamala Harris is, even though if she does become the Democratic National Convention's nominee, there's still going to be a lot of baggage being carried with her. Everything from the Biden administration is going to follow her as well. This is not going to be a clean slate. This is not like if another Democrat might have come in. This is the sitting vice president potentially becoming the Democratic nominee for president.
Yeah, I know. And to answer some of those questions, Eleanor, senior national correspondent Peter Zampa, joining us once again from New York City. Peter, thank you so much for following this. We've heard now from a couple more people, President Trump a couple times since we last spoke, Vice President Kamala Harris since we spoke. What are your thoughts on some of the messaging still coming out now as people are really reacting to this in the past couple of hours?
Yeah, hey guys, with the initial shock sort of subsiding now, you're seeing the cracks filling in, especially among Democrats. By and large, they're all first gracious that he is taking this step. You haven't heard from many that they're upset that he is doing this. I think a lot of folks knew that this was how this had to take shape. But then you're also starting to see a lot of them, now that he has officially endorsed Kamala Harris, you're seeing others fall in line with that as well, which, again, I know, Ryan, we talked about this earlier, but this is an important moment for Democrats because there has been so much chaos since June 27th. It has been Dems in disarray, to quote the old adage. They need to find themselves in line behind a candidate quickly. And now you do have some folks who are not willing to take that step. We saw that statement from former President Barack Obama, who a lot of people thought was one of Joe Biden's best friends. He didn't fall in line with Joe Biden on this. He did not endorse Kamala Harris in his statement thanking the president for his service. He's in support of an open nominating process. So will that create more chaos among these Democrats, or is that how, frankly, a lot of people feel this has to go in hopes of not disenfranchising the 14 million plus people who voted for Joe Biden and not necessarily Kamala Harris? These, again, are the questions that we need answers to quickly for the Democrats to put all of this chaos to bed.
And, this has been a topsy-turvy election cycle for both parties. Republicans came into the RNC last week with a message of unity. Seems like they all got on board and are heading off in the distance. How quickly do the Democrats need to get behind that same message, and how quickly can they?
Well, yeah, I mean, Ryan, look, if the Democrats are waiting for a month to get to the DNC to hold this open nominating process, that creates a lot of problems for them, frankly. On the campaign trail, big donors, they don't know who their candidate is. The money could dry up. I mean, that's a huge reason Joe Biden, according to a political strategist I've been speaking to, that's really the reason he had to drop out of this race, is because, yeah, you get these calls from other Democrats to step aside, but once the money stops flowing, you need to really consider not to run. So now, are they going to go through the next month with tentative donors, not really knowing who's at the top of the ticket? Or are they all going to fall in line behind Kamala Harris? Right now, it sounds like the latter. It does seem like that is where the momentum is heading, to back Vice President Kamala Harris, to bring some order to this party right now, because time is of the essence. I think a lot of people would say they don't have a month to come together behind a candidate. They might hold an early nominating process, as folks were kind of mulling over whether to do that for Joe Biden, for Ohio ballot reasons initially. And then when they started to see cards falling not in his favor, they thought, hey, let's get ahead of the DNC. Well, maybe they'll consider doing that for Vice President Harris as well before the convention in Chicago, because again, time is of the essence. They need to calm the fears of not just their Democratic base, but if they want any of these independents to fall in line, they need to start with a concerted, unified message as soon as possible to show them that they're not the party of chaos. They are the ones who have the answers, and the answers are going to come from the top of the ticket, and Kamala Harris potentially.
Yeah, as Ryan mentioned, it seems like Republicans are full steam ahead right now. Democrats still trying to figure out which way they're going to turn. Talk a little bit about what Kamala Harris might have to do in order to get those votes of the delegates, really, at the DNC. What is it that she needs to do? How can she convey this message with only less than maybe a month left until the Democratic National Convention?
Well, first of all, Rashida, I think a lot of folks would say that in her message that she sent out today, saying that she is running, I think she did strike the right tone in saying she plans to earn these votes. She's not some anointed figure in a monarchy. She is still in a democratic system. She's acknowledging that she's not yet the candidate, that this still has to go through a process, but that she wants it and that she wants to earn it. As far as what she needs to do, really, she just needs to portray that strength that I think a lot of Democratic leaders and lawmakers were afraid just was not coming from this White House over the last couple of weeks, whether it be because of President Biden's debate performance, his health, otherwise, they just did not think that there was this concise message of strength being portrayed domestically or abroad. So I think that's what these Democrats really are looking for when they think about who they want to be at the top of the ticket. But we should make it clear, she was on a ticket that did have all these 14 million plus votes. She is the clear frontrunner, the natural successor. Now, that's not how these things work, but you would think she just needs to have a steady voice over the next couple of weeks to assure them that, yes, this is still the presidency and the vice presidency that you voted for. I'm carrying forward with our policies, maybe some more of my own, but this is the ticket you wanted. I'm just the more sure voice right now, representative of that ticket.
And Peter, we know we've been talking a little bit about reaction coming from both sides. Is there anything that you're hearing specifically from some of the lawmakers that you interview? What are they saying? What have you seen and what have you heard over the last maybe few hours that maybe we haven't discussed?
Yeah, I think the interesting side by side that we're seeing is the ones who do endorse Kamala Harris right away and the ones who don't, the ones who are clearly a little unsure. And now one thing I have been looking out for that I really haven't quite seen just yet is anyone outright disgusted by this. Now, you have some folks in the Democratic sphere who have said, hey, you see what you've done, media or other Democrats, you pushed out a great man, a great president, the best that we'll ever see. But as far as actual lawmakers and people who are going to be potential superdelegates or delegates at the DNC, you're really not seeing that frustration. It's just a lot of gratitude. You're not seeing that divide. Again, this has been a huge unifying moment for Democrats. Now it's all about how they can carry forward with this momentum, clearly that is frustrating Republicans. And on the Republican side, as I just alluded to, you do have a lot of frustration. You have people almost as a cop-out for their frustration saying, well, he should step aside if he can't run for president, trying to come up with answers in a really sticky situation for them because they wanted to run against Joe Biden. They saw the numbers that were coming in for President Trump, former President Trump, after objectively a great couple of weeks for him. And now they have a whole new ticket they're going to have to deal with. It'll be a younger ticket. It'll be a more energized ticket, something that I just don't think Republicans want to have to deal with necessarily.
All right. And Peter, I know you've been covering the cases with Donald Trump and the felony case, and talk a little bit about how that's going to play a role. Do you think that's going to make a difference when it comes to, we're talking about a former attorney general that could potentially be running up against former President Trump and potentially debating one another. Kind of what do you make of that situation with someone who is a convicted felon and the former attorney general of a state of California? Talk a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, that's a great point, Rashida. She knows how to deal with the justice system in this country. She was also on the Senate Judiciary Committee, one of the stronger voices on that committee. Even as a young Democrat in the U.S. Senate, a freshman Democratic senator, she was still seen as a voice of reason and someone who knew the law of the land in that committee. So yes, during debates, that could be a tough task for Donald Trump. However, in recent weeks, Donald Trump has only gotten good news on his legal cases, He just had one thrown out in Florida. Now that will go through an appeals process, but it will be severely delayed if it ever comes to light. Same thing with the Supreme Court handing down that immunity ruling. Donald Trump now has all these cards in his back pocket that he did not have as I was covering this felony trial for weeks on end, that it resulted in a felony conviction on 34 counts. That seemed like the low point for Donald Trump that day. And now, as far as his legal woes go, he is at a high point with everything coming up. Donald Trump, all of this good news for him. So during the debates, yes, she will inevitably, first of all, if she is at the top of the ticket, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, but if she is at the top of the ticket and she is going head to head with Donald Trump, she is not the person that Trump wants to see. But with all of this good news, it could come at a worse time for him.
And Peter, you've seen Republicans attacking this issue from a couple different directions. Surprised by their responses and some of the things they're being outward about and saying?
This Democratic elections, this gentleman I've been speaking to is involved in many Democratic elections in the past, said they bring up some good points when you talk about a potentially undemocratic process. Now, that may be a bit of a dramatic framing of what's going to come with the delegates choosing who they want to be at the top of the ticket if they hold an open convention or just a nominating process that takes place before the convention. 14 million people voted in these primaries for Joe Biden. And Kamala Harris on the ticket as well, but they voted for Joe Biden to be at the top of the ticket. So what comes next? If the Republicans are going to frame this as an undemocratic process, that could catch on with some Americans. However, the other side of what they're calling for him to step down because they see him in cognitive decline, and if he can't run for president, then why should he stay in the White House? A lot of folks say there's just zero merit to that kind of claim, that just because he doesn't want to run again at this point. He made no mention of his health yet as a reason for stepping aside or his cognitive abilities. This is strictly a man saying he thinks it's best for the country if he does not run. The reasons still remain. We understand he is going to tell us a little bit more details later this week, but for Republicans to call for him to step aside, it's a bit frivolous in a lot of experts' minds.
Yeah, it seems like that's something that maybe we don't have time for right now. Time is of the essence. We have about 4 months left until the election. So if Republicans do want to focus their time on coming after Biden and asking him to step aside, that'll be interesting to see how they can do that and still juggle a brand new nominee there.
Peter?
Yeah, Rashida, that's right. After today, they're probably going to want to stop talking about Joe Biden and really focus on Kamala Harris. They can keep talking about Joe Biden's policies, the ones they think will be winning issues for Republicans in November, talking about the border, talking about inflation, and trying to tie her to these policies. Another question I actually had for this Democratic strategist I've been speaking to was, what if it's someone who doesn't necessarily have the baggage of the Biden White House that Republicans are using to their advantage? And they said any Democrat that might step into the top of the ticket role will be tied to Joe Biden because they've all been supportive, for the most part, of his policies. Any Democrat in the land that wanted to run right now would still be tied to immigration policy in this country, economic policy in this country, the things that Republicans are really trying to hit Democrats on. No matter who's at the top of the ticket, it is going to stick to them. So it's about finding someone who's already been on the campaign trail, Kamala Harris, talking about issues that Democrats can win on. Reproductive rights. She's fine-tuned on those fronts in all of these crucial battleground states. Clearly the one who is the successor to Joe Biden. A lot of folks think it makes sense just to go ahead with her. So Republicans are going to want to sharpen their knives when it comes to Kamala Harris specifically, starting 3 hours ago.
Yeah, she's certainly going to be a tough candidate to debate. We know that for sure, being a former attorney general. If she does, in fact, become the Democratic nominee for president, it's something that we're certainly going to be watching. We know you're going to be covering for us, Peter, at the DNC. Peter Zampa, our national correspondent, thank you so much for joining us.
You bet.
We're just now getting word that Vice President Kamala Harris and President Biden have had multiple conversations throughout the day. If you're just tuning in, President Biden has decided to step away from the 2024 election. He has now given his endorsement to Vice President Kamala Harris. They are both on the same ticket. It's something that a lot of Democrats were expecting. Some of them have not been sold, but we know that Kamala Harris has given her statement saying that she needs to earn the vote. She doesn't believe that she is, necessarily going to be already at the top before the DNC. She's willing to earn the delegates' votes. And that's something that we're going to continue to keep an eye on. We're just weeks away from the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where Democrats, they have to get behind someone. If not Kamala Harris, the question is who?
Yeah, exactly. And we'll know a little bit more details before then. We know President Biden is expected to address the nation sometime this week. He said that in that letter that he posted on social media when he stated that he was stepping out of the race. Now, what exactly he's going to say more, not clear. One thing we can say, just to keep the human aspect in all this, President Biden is still recovering from COVID. We got a message earlier this morning from his doctor saying that he's doing much better. He's been on the mend for a couple of days. So keep that in mind, especially while people may have questions on why he posted on social media instead of saying something in general. Just keep that in mind. He is still a human recovering from COVID, but he is doing much better. Keep that on the top of our minds here. But like you said, Rashid, once again, he did announce that he is bowing out of the race. He is stepping aside. He has endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris. We've seen other endorsements for Vice President Kamala Harris, and remains to be seen who else's name might be thrown in a hat and how this process will break down, because it can come down a couple of different ways. But obviously those questions are probably being answered in private rooms behind closed doors at the moment, while people continue to make their decision on exactly what's going on. And remember, this is breaking news from Local News Live. I'm Ryan Henson. This is Rashida Kaba here joining me in studio. We've been trying to cover this wall-to-wall coverage. Another weekend here with L&L wall-to-wall coverage. We might bring some cots in here after a while.
I was going to say, just last week, we have to remember the former president got shot. It's crazy to think that 1 week has passed, and this is now the breaking news. Thanks so much for tuning in with us here on Local News Live.
Right. And once again, current President Joe Biden obviously stepping aside now. A lot of people wondering what comes next. We've heard a lot of reaction from Republicans who are weighing in, mainly attacking the situation, saying, hey, if Joe Biden is not fit now, fit to run for a presidential election, he is not fit to be in the White House right now. He must leave. Also, them coming after the party as a whole, saying, hey, 14 million Americans voted for Joe Biden, so you're going to betray them and obviously force him off the ticket, in the words of many of the people in the GOP. I'm sure we'll hear a lot more as people return to Capitol Hill after the Republicans were in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for the RNC last week, and Democrats probably back home taking a break in their home districts right now. It's going to be an interesting week in Washington coming up, as a lot of business is taking place outside of this news. I can only imagine how much more people are going to be ready for 8 a.m. on Monday, going up to Capitol Hill with a ton of work ahead of them and a ton of interviews too.
As you mentioned, you have to think he is still the sitting president. He still has 4 months left to serve. So it's going to be interesting to see if this impacts the remainder of his presidency. Is this something that, I know he's had talks with other foreign leaders. You also have Ukraine that's at war right now.
Benjamin Netanyahu is coming to D.C. next week. We're talking about a big week. He's coming to D.C. next week, expected to speak with the president, probably vice president, but for sure President Biden Tuesday, addressing Congress on Wednesday. How that conversation might change now that President Biden, everybody knows, hey, he's going to be out of here in a couple of months. We all know what it's like to have a job and know, hey, I'll be out of here shortly. So if Benjamin Netanyahu gives the same concern concessions that maybe he was already prepared for. It's going to be interesting with that. At the end of last week, we know that Israel says that there was a ceasefire deal almost at the finish line. So we'll see how that goes. And once again, this is breaking news from Local News Live. I'm Ryan Henson.
And I'm Rashida Kaba. President Biden has announced he will drop out of the 2024 presidential election and has endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris as a Democratic nominee.
And this comes after Democrats pushed him and his campaign to drop out of the race, fearing his ability to win in November against former President Donald Trump. Now, the president insisted for weeks he would not back down. He said repeatedly he feels he's the best candidate to beat Republican Donald Trump.
Now, the calls for Biden to step aside grew significantly after his dismal debate performance against Donald Trump. Both publicly and privately, several Democrats, more high profile in recent days, called on Biden to drop his reelection bid. Let's take a look at a statement from President Biden earlier today. He said, well, Biden, we do know that Biden took to social media to say that he's stepping down. He says, here, my fellow Democrats, I have decided not to accept the nomination and to focus all my energies on my duties as president for the remainder of my term. My very first decision as the party nominee in 2020 was to pick Kamala Harris as my vice president, and it's been the best decision that I've made. Today, I want to offer my full support and endorsement for Kamala to be the nominee of our party this year. Democrats, it's time to come together and beat Trump. Let's do this. That was from President Biden, and that was his second post. I saw on Instagram, I followed it on Instagram. The initial post was that he's dropping out. This very next second post, maybe within minutes, was him saying, I endorse Kamala Harris.
Let's bring in L&L Washington correspondent Josh Rotenberg. He was with me in studio for hours earlier today. He's been following the breaking news. Josh, what did the president's letter say? Go in depth on what you're hearing.
Yeah, good evening, Ryan and Rashida. So President Biden released this letter on X, formerly known as Twitter, at 1:46 p.m., this historic announcement in which he said it was the greatest honor of his life to serve as president of the United States. But he said it was, quote, in the best interest to focus solely on my duties as president. He also added later in that letter that there will be an address coming from him later this week as far as what exactly went into this decision. Obviously, we were all on pins and needles to try to figure out exactly how President Biden made this decision and why, because as you guys have highlighted, for weeks he has been adamant that he has been staying in this race, but as of today, that's no longer the case.
And Josh, what's the reaction been amongst the Democratic Party? Obviously, they're still trying to come together after all this.
Yeah, so it's really been different tiers of different reaction here. So you've heard from leadership, you've heard from former presidents, you've heard from rank and file members on Capitol Hill in both the House and the Senate. First and foremost, what all of them are saying is that they are thanking Joe Biden ultimately for the legacy that he leaves behind for this one term that he will serve as president of the United States. Now, some taking it a step further and calling him a patriot and saying that he was right to ultimately step aside, and they thank him for that. The third tier of reaction has to do with some of them now endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris to serve as the next president of the United States. Obviously, President Biden did that as well in a subsequent statement that he put out. So with that said, the one thing that we have not heard, whether it's from former President Barack Obama, former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, or House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, none of them have endorsed a candidate moving forward here to take over for Joe Biden, even though we are seeing rank and file Democrats on Capitol Hill support Vice President Kamala Harris.
Yeah, as you just mentioned, Democrats saying that he is a patriot, I should say. President Biden is a patriot. That's what they're saying. Kamala Harris, to be the nomination for president ahead of the convention in August, this is a quick turnaround. Talk a little bit about the Republican reaction. Brian and I have been talking about how this is something that's going to carry with her when it comes to the Biden administration and everything that they have championed. She's not going there with not going with any baggage. She's certainly going to be targeted for some of the things that she's passed. Talk about the Republican reaction and kind of how they're targeting Kamala Harris now.
Well, so there's two different reactions, right? Obviously, there's the first reaction to Joe Biden dropping out of the race. And then second, they're going after Kamala Harris because there's widespread speculation that she could be the next Democratic nominee for president. Obviously, she is not that right now, but she could be. First, let's stick with Joe Biden first. You had former President Donald Trump and House Speaker Mike Johnson basically all saying the same thing, that Joe Biden is unfit to run, therefore he is unfit to serve, and that he should not just drop out of the race, but that he should resign from office immediately. There is no sign that President Biden or anybody on his team has suggested that the president do that. Now, as far as Vice President Kamala Harris is concerned, we're already seeing attack ads online on social media going after Vice President Harris, saying that she enabled Joe Biden to get to the position that he's in right now. They have alleged that she has taken part in some quote-unquote cover-up as far as the president's abilities to serve as president. And so with that said, they're going after her. And that's not any surprise. They've gone after her for years while she's been vice president and ultimately potentially as she becomes the next Democratic nominee for president.
And Josh, obviously we're in the land of hypotheticals already. Let's just say, we do go to the convention. It's an open convention. Kind of explain for folks at home how that might work, because that has been an idea that's been floated by high members of, the Democratic Party.
Yeah, look, while there's a number of rank-and-file Democrats that have come out supporting Vice President Kamala Harris to be the Democratic nominee for president, that is not just automatic. That's not just a done deal. Ultimately, the Democratic delegates that all voted for Joe Biden to be the Democratic nominee, they now have to turn around and do the same for Kamala Harris if she is going to be the nominee. Now, we will see if ultimately in the coming hours and days, if there are any other potential candidates for president that want to step forward, whether they are on Capitol Hill, whether they're in the Biden administration, whether they are current governors around the United States, whether or not they come forward, that all remains to be seen. If everyone unites behind Kamala Harris, then this will be a formality next month in Chicago that all the delegates will likely vote for her. But there's no sign right now that that is the case. Again, we just got done saying that Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, and former President Barack Obama have not endorsed Kamala Harris at this moment in time. That could change, but if it doesn't, and this does go to an open convention, then we'll go back to where things were just a couple decades ago, where ultimately, if you were a candidate for president, you had to go to the convention, you had to lobby behind closed doors for delegates to ultimately support you, and then you had to win the majority of delegates. We don't know if that is going to happen, but if it does, that's how everything would work out.
And as we mentioned, Republicans, they're trying to focus on the Biden administration as a whole after this endorsement for Kamala Harris just came down. And we just got breaking news. J.D. Vance just put out a statement. In part, he says she owns all of these failures. She lied for nearly 4 years about Biden's mental capacity, saddling the nation with a president who can't do the job. President Trump and I are ready to save America. Whoever is at the top of that Democratic ticket, bring it on.
Yeah, look, I mean, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance is obviously former President Donald Trump's running mate, and so he is going to say, and he's going to stay in lockstep with former President Donald Trump as far as not only attacking Joe Biden and the decision that was made today, but attacking Vice President Kamala Harris, because as of right now, again, there's widespread speculation that she could be the next Democratic nominee for president. And so ultimately, we're going to see what happens in the coming days, but the one thing that is clear when it comes to Republicans, they're unified behind their presidential nominee and their vice presidential nominee, and they're unified against Biden and Harris and this administration and those two as candidates. And obviously, Joe Biden's not a candidate anymore, but Vice President Kamala Harris says that she's throwing her hat in the ring, and so we'll see ultimately if she is the nominee.
That's Washington correspondent Josh Rotenberg once again dipping in with more insight and expertise. Josh, thank you so much. Always appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, guys.
And with President Biden's announcement, the move creates a vacuum in the Democratic Party with fewer than 5 months to crown a successor.
Certainly a quick turnaround, but as politics play out on the national stage in real time, we wanted to take a look back at the events of the last 3 weeks and how they sealed the president's fate. Molly Martinez has it.
In motion a series of events that destabilized the Biden reelection campaign. In an effort to do immediate damage control, 1 week later, the president agreed to a sit-down interview with George Stephanopoulos.
If the Lord Almighty came down and said, Joe, get out of the race, I'll get out of the race. The Lord Almighty's not coming down.
The interview did little to quell the growing anxiety in the party, with several congressional members calling for the president to bow out.
The president of the United States doesn't have the vigor necessary to overcome the deficit.
Now, celebrities were getting involved, with friend and mega donor George Clooney penning an op-ed in the New York Times that the president was unfit to serve another term. On July 11th, following the NATO summit in Washington, D.C., the president put himself in the hot seat, hosting his first ever solo press conference in 8 months. The attempt to show off his acumen for foreign policy was eclipsed by this gaffe.
I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president.
The redemption tour continued, despite a growing chorus of members of his own party calling for a replacement. Then, the event no one could have predicted. This stunning, pivotal moment catapulted support for Donald Trump and forced many to take an even harder look, not just at Joe Biden's viability as a candidate, but the survivability of the party with important congressional and Senate races at stake. In the days after the attempted assassination, reports grew of high-ranking Democrats, including Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi and former President Barack Obama, asking for intervention. These calls were heated, with Biden announcing it's time to pass the torch. We're still a month out from the DNC, where the party faces a reckoning of identity and leadership. In Washington, I'm Molly Martinez.
Now, Biden has made history just months ahead of November's election. The big question now, who will Democrats choose as his replacement at the top of the ticket, and how will this all play out? Amber McReynolds is an American elections expert and independent voter. She was appointed by President Biden to serve as the first woman on the Postal Service Board of Governors. Amber, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, Amber, first off, your reaction to today's news.
Well, goodness, I can't imagine something, an announcement that is more politically courageous, humble, kind, and frankly demonstrates President Biden's enduring legacy and in public service. He has served this country in an incredible way, and I think this further demonstrates his legacy and how much he deeply loves and cares for this country.
Yeah, and I know you're a leading expert on election administration and policy, as well as political conventions. And we're just a few weeks away from the Democratic National Convention. This is going to be an interesting time. Go ahead, walk us through what will happen in the next days, the weeks ahead of the DNC for many of us who have never lived through something like this.
Yeah, well, both the RNC and the DNC have rules in place for not only how they conduct their elections, but how it works up to and leading up to a convention, and what the process for delegate engagement actually looks like. And both parties have processes in place. They have rules in place. And certainly there is a lot going on at the DNC right now as they think through what the next days and weeks ahead will look like. What I think is really important and what is very different about this is the number of unaffiliated voters and independent voters that now exists in the country. We're at about 51% nationally. We have 22 states that still have closed primary processes. So what I think is really going to be important for the DNC to think about is how they create an engaging and enduring process over the next few weeks, so that they can not only engage the delegates, but also engage all of the American people at large in a process that respects democracy, ensures democracy, respects obviously their rules and their procedures, but also creates a vehicle for the American people to have voice and have influence and have a process that engages them and creates civic enthusiasm along the way as well.
And talk about the actual convention. What will Democrats need to do at the DNC in Chicago in a couple of weeks?
Yeah, well, so the convention process obviously exists, and they have rules about how delegates engage and vote. And interestingly, and I just want to give this piece of history, on the Democratic side, there's been 15 contested or brokered or open conventions, meaning that, they had to have multiple ballots or they had to have a process. And on the Republican side, there's been 9 instances of that in our history. On the Republican side, one of those brokered or contested elections was actually in 1860 when Abraham Lincoln won, and I think it actually occurred in Chicago after three rounds of ballots. On the Democratic side, one of the most significant presidents that came out of a a brokered or contested election was actually FDR in 1932 after 4 ballot rounds. So this has happened before. Both parties have rules in place. They're very thoughtful about what those rules look like, and I anticipate that the DNC will be very communicative, not only with the delegates, but with the public at large about what the process will look like. And again, I just hope that it is deeply engaging, deeply thoughtful about how not only to embrace and hear from voters within the Democratic Party, but also think about what their outreach looks like for this 51% of the American public that are now unaffiliated and are going to have a big say in the outcome in November.
Yeah, you just mentioned that brokered convention. There was also one, it looks like in 1952. Talk about the historical context. It's interesting because that one was also in Chicago. This one's going to be in Chicago. Not sure if that's the situation in Chicago, is that we always have a little bit of chaos at the DNC.
They planned it.
Yeah, but talk a little bit about the historic context. I mean, this is going to go down in the history books, and how quickly things need to come together for Democrats.
Yeah, and I think the history here in particular is we've never had 51% of the country be independent, and about 60% of voters under 30 fall in that category. And we still have a lot of states that have closed primaries. So I think what's really important in the days and weeks ahead is for the DNC to be super thoughtful about how they engage delegates, how they encourage delegates to hear from constituencies around the country. And I think it could actually be historic and set a new precedent for how the parties engage with the American electorate. So to me, this is a huge opportunity for the DNC to be super innovative, super thoughtful about that engagement, super thoughtful about how to, bring different voices into the process that maybe didn't exist before, and really create the kind of civic enthusiasm that we frankly have never seen in American politics. And, so for me, I think it's just a huge opportunity that they have. At the convention itself, they will have a process like they always do for delegates to cast their ballot. And that will very much depend on what happens in the next few days in terms of which candidates. Obviously, we've already seen Vice President Harris declare that she's going to put her name in. There might be others. We're not sure of what that will look like yet. But as that continues to play out in the next few days, I think it's really important that the DNC just be super thoughtful about how they communicate those rules, how they communicate that process, and how they can create maximum engagement amongst the American electorate, which would set a new precedent for how parties can engage with the electorate at large in this very important process.
And in your experience working elections and as an independent voter yourself, you feel this could be a big moment for independent voters, and explain why.
Well, so given that independent voters have been growing in margin and in veracity over the past few decades, where we're culminating at this moment where more than 51%, according to a recent Gallup assessment, is now 51% of the electorate. And so that's a first time threshold. We've never seen independents grow to be that high. And so I just think it's critically important that both parties think about how those independent voters are going to think about the election come November, but also how the parties adjust what may be their historic and normal processes to engage that very significant, very important group of electors, especially given that 60% of young people under the age of 30 are registered independent, and that's also growing. And so I just think that there's a huge opportunity here for that electorate to be engaged. They are the ones deciding a lot of elections, especially in swing states now going forward. And so, I think whichever major party figures out how best to engage that segment of the population, be super thoughtful about what their perspectives are, and be super thoughtful about how to pull those voices in, to encourage those voices to participate, will be the victors ultimately come November.
Yeah, one thing that we do know is that time is of the essence here. Talk a little bit about the time that we have left as well as the money. So a lot of times people aren't thinking about the campaign funds that went into this election. This is essentially the whole 4 years. If you are going up for re-election, you are raising money during that time frame. Talk about where the money that the Biden administration goes now and how quickly, if there is another Democratic nominee, if it's not Kamala Harris, how quickly that person has to raise the amount of funds that they need to go forward.
Sure. Well, and campaign finance laws are another segment of the election process that have, detailed rules and laws and regulations around them. There's obviously super PACs and political action committees that have been operating. They have a certain set of rules. The campaign itself has another set of rules. So all of the sort of rules and regulations around the money are going to matter greatly, and a lot of that's going to be worked out in the coming days. Often, when you have a presidential campaign, money is not only going from the campaign, but it's also going out to the state parties themselves for their operations and how that all plays out. So I anticipate that there will be a lot more clarity around what some of those things look like in the coming days. And I'm sure there are very smart campaign finance lawyers that are thinking about what this all means in the next few days. And certainly, I've already seen a lot of communications today about how much Vice President Harris is raising and has been raising since this announcement was made, and even the Democratic Party itself. So all of those rules and regulations, again, will play out. And, again, those things are kind of one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is the actual running of the election at the convention. And so the delegates are going to need to vote. It will very much, the process itself will very much depend on how many people are in that equation with regards to running for president. And then there's also the VP selection process. And so, again, I think the more engaging, transparent, thoughtful process that can ensue is the best for the American people, because really the DNC, I think at this point, has an opportunity to create tremendous civic enthusiasm, pull more of the electorate in to see the process and be able to hear from whoever might be putting their names forward for both the presidential position, but also the vice presidential candidate. And really, this is a historic moment for sure, given that we are in a technical era too, that allows people to express their voices more quickly and more directly over social media and all of the avenues that we now have that didn't exist 50 years ago when we last saw some of these more competitive conventions.
And Amber, I know you, like probably many others, probably could have saw this move coming by President Biden. But is there anything that you're particularly shocked or surprised about now that we're a couple hours into it?
Well, I actually had no idea. I'm not a member of the party. President Biden, you mentioned this at the introduction, he appointed me to be a governor for the Postal Service, which is a presidential appointee, Senate confirmed. I think I'm the first independent that was ever appointed in that role. And I was tapped for my experience, not only working with the Postal Service, but also working as an election official. So, I look at that and think, gosh, I've spent most of my career in public service and just trying to improve the process for everyone. And I thought that President Biden's announcement today really demonstrated a leadership that he has really promoted throughout his entire career in public service. It demonstrated an endearing love for this country and respect for the American people. And I really think that it's a good example of what public service should look like and what political courage should look like for others to follow and emulate. And certainly it's I think a great example for future generations, like my own kids that are 11 and 13. And, I think anytime we can see political leaders put their country first and really be thoughtful about how they see their political future and also their legacy is really important. And this will be everlasting for sure.
Yeah, we know President Biden is a prideful man, so for him to step aside and say, you know what, time is now, I'm going to pass the torch. It's definitely a big move. Amber McReynolds, election expert, thanks so much for joining us and giving us that valuable insight.
Thank you.
And of course, we've been reading these different statements that have been coming into our newsroom. Namely, let's start with Vice President Kamala Harris. She released a statement. We want to read it in full. It says, quote, "On behalf of the American people, I thank Joe Biden for his extraordinary leadership as President of the United States and for his decades of service to our country. His remarkable legacy of accomplishment is unmatched in modern American history, surpassing the legacy of many presidents who have served 2 terms in office."
And she adds, it is a profound honor to serve as his vice president, adding, quote, with this selfless and patriotic act, President Biden is doing what he has done throughout his life of service, putting the American people and our country above everything else. I'm honored to have the president's endorsement, and my intention is to earn and win this nomination. Over the past year, I have traveled across the country talking with Americans about the clear choice in this momentous election, and that is what I will continue to do in the days and weeks ahead. I will do everything in my power to unite the Democratic Party and unite our nation to defeat Donald Trump and his Extreme Project 2025 agenda. We have 107 days until Election Day. Together, we will fight, and together we will win. And this from Vice President Kamala Harris, obviously the main person being endorsed by several leaders in the Democratic Party, including President Joe Biden as the potential nominee.
Yeah, and what's interesting, we talked about that, people trying to say, there are other people that maybe want to come forward and, we have some time until the DNC, but you have to think about those campaign funds.
Yeah.
And luckily for Kamala Harris, the good thing here, the AP is reporting that she already has campaign apparatus in place, already has access to campaign and affiliated group funds. So
that's because her name's on the paperwork, to be clear.
Exactly. And so that's kind of why a lot of people are saying, let's get behind Kamala Harris. It'll make it a little bit easier for Democrats to be able to come behind one solidified person. There's a lot of technicalities that go into the campaign funds, that go into the DNC. There's a lot of different rules that you have to follow. Not only that, but the next person has to find their vice president in order to be able to get on certain states' ballots.
And technicality, you forgot about the other T word. Time. And time is of the essence. You heard her right there. 107 days until Election Day. Not much time at all to launch a presidential campaign. Now, luckily, like we've just saying, she already has a head start. Head start with the money. Head start with the name recognition. So that's why.
Head start with the endorsement from the current president.
Head start with the endorsement from the current president. And you've heard a lot of other people prominent in the party as well saying, hey, she's a person we can get behind. So it's interesting. I had to talk to her face-to-face a couple of months ago, back in February, obviously still very much a vice presidential nominee, but some of these concerns were still on the minds of Americans. I asked her about it at the time. I asked the vice president if she was ready to take the reins if, for whatever reason, Joe Biden decided to step aside. Here's what she had to say.
I think one of the concerns that Americans have about the age is just older people have, more health issues. It's a real thing. What do you say to those concerns? And specifically, if he had to pass the powers to you for 1 second, 1 minute, heaven forbid, and I ask with all due respect, but, are you capable? Are you ready to step into the role and do whatever the country would need?
Absolutely ready.
All right, you just heard Kamala Harris there saying she is willing and ready to take the reins. Ryan Henson spoke to her back in February, and you said for whatever reason. It didn't matter if it was her stepping in the shoes of the president, the sitting president under this administration, or if it's to be the next president. We've been hearing so many different responses from across party lines. One thing that has remained true, I think, from all the Democrats is that each of them that we've seen that have come forward and given a statement today are saying he's a patriot. He's putting country and service above self. We know how prideful President Biden is. He was asked weeks ago, right after the CNN presidential debate, the disastrous presidential debate, the infamous one, if he would be able to step down. If he was asked by top Democratic officials if he would step down, what he would do. He said he had no plans to step down. He said only if God himself came down and told him to step down would he step down. That's how you know he took this very seriously. And it had to have been something, that came over him that said, you know what, that's what's going to be best for the country. Even his former boss coming out, former President Barack Obama releasing a statement saying, in part, we will be navigating uncharted waters in the days ahead. But I have extraordinary confidence that the leaders of our party will be able to create a process from which an outstanding nominee emerges. I believe that Joe Biden's vision of a generous, prosperous, and united America that provides opportunity for everyone will be on full display at the Democratic Convention in August. And I expect that every single one of us are prepared to carry that message of hope and progress forward into November and beyond. He says, for now, Michelle and I just want to express our love and gratitude to Joe and Jill for leading us so ably and courageously during these perilous times and for their commitment to the ideals of freedom and equality that this country was founded on.
And for more insight on this whole situation as it develops since about 1:45 this afternoon, Washington correspondent Josh Raltenberg once again joining us here in studio. Josh, I mean, last time we checked in, any new updates? Still, what are you thinking about as you have these conversations and obviously continue to report on this breaking news here?
So the one update that we have taken notice of is one thing that's worth noting. When Joe Biden was still running, obviously this was a ticket that was made up of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and it was the Biden-Harris campaign. And so all of the money that has been raised was under the Biden-Harris campaign. And they've raised north of $90 million right now, or at least I should say that's the cash on hand that ultimately they have. And so always the question is what was going to happen to that money if ultimately Joe Biden did step aside and he was no longer going to be the top of a presidential ticket? Well, we're now learning through the FEC that ultimately Vice President Kamala Harris now has her own group. It is called Harris for President, and she has taken over that war chest that is north of $90 million. It was always speculated that she would have ultimately the inside track to that money. It appears as if right now that she could be taking that over, but obviously we will follow that.
And, you know, we're still trying to figure out who the next Democratic National Convention nominee is going to be. We have weeks away. How quickly, we've talked about this with some of the other people that have come on, how quickly the next person, whoever it may be, as you can hear, you just mentioned Kamala Harris already has that cash on hand because she is already a candidate on that same ticket as Joe Biden. How quickly, if the Democrats do come forward and say, you know what, we want to try something new, how quickly would that person and how capable potentially could they be to get these votes and to get the money that they need to continue this campaign into election 2024?
Well, this is such an unprecedented situation. We've really never seen this before. So ultimately, this is going to be something that we can't rely back on history for to say what exactly could happen. But really, there's only two schools of thought as to what could happen as far as who could be the next Democratic nominee. Number one, that the party simply unites behind Kamala Harris. And before we even get to the convention in Chicago next month, that everybody is just on the same page, that all of the delegates are going to vote for Kamala Harris, and whatever money she raises in between now and then and afterwards, it's all for her and whoever her next running mate is. That's the first case scenario. The other scenario is things just open up. And we haven't seen an open convention for either party in decades. And ultimately, what that would take is for anybody that puts their hat in the ring that's not named Kamala Harris, as she would go against them and would try to lobby some of the delegates in Chicago to vote for that person, and they would need a majority ultimately to be crowned the Democratic nominee. And so we'll see ultimately what happens, but there's 3 or 4 weeks before we get to Chicago, and things are really likely to be decided before then.
And Josh, talk about some of the things that need to be decided. I've talked about unity today. Obviously, it might be a little too early for a running mate, but also, some of these people, everybody get in line. Talk about how important it is for everybody getting on the same page like the Republicans are, who are full steam ahead after their convention.
Well, you just got done saying it. I mean, if there's one of the two parties that's absolutely united and unified right now, it is the Republican Party. You just saw that in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. For the third straight time, Republicans have nominated Donald Trump to be their nominee. Now, with that said, Democrats have been fractured ever since June 27th, ever since that presidential debate that Joe Biden had, where it was a performance that he would like to have back, that over the course of 90 minutes, he struggled to get out his message. And so ultimately, with that said, Democrats are hoping that today that Joe Biden has dropped out of the race, that there will be some unity. As of right now, they are not completely unified behind one given person, even though we are seeing different lawmakers and former President Bill Clinton coming out and supporting Vice President Kamala Harris to be the next nominee. So we'll see ultimately if they can get on the same page before Chicago and in Chicago, and then obviously after Chicago, because after that you'll have 3 months until November 5th.
Yeah, and while Republicans are full steam ahead, this is a decision that certainly ruffles their feathers as well. Talk about what the Trump administration, or the Trump campaign, I should say, has to do right now in order to pivot in time for the November election and in time for the next debate, really.
So the one interesting thing when it comes to the Trump campaign and Republicans in general, for as much as they bashed Joe Biden and the fact that he was the person going against Trump, what you had been hearing, though, was Republicans were really hoping that Joe Biden did not get out of the race because ultimately the former president felt that his easiest path to victory was against Joe Biden. Now, could things become easier against somebody else? We're going to have to wait and see ultimately to answer that question. But now we're already seeing attack ads from the Trump campaign and from Republicans in general against Vice President Harris because she is widely speculated to potentially be the next Democratic nominee for president. So with that said, Republicans are united against Joe Biden, against Kamala Harris, against Democrats in general. And so they're going full speed ahead with their candidate, Donald Trump, and they are confident because they are unified right now that Trump will win re-election. But of course, we'll have to wait and see if that's true.
That's Washington correspondent Josh Rotenberg right there. Josh, thank you so much for dipping in with that insight and information right there. I'm sure we'll see you here in just a little bit.
Thanks for having me.
All right, and we are getting some new information from different lawmakers and different Republicans and Democrats. We just want to read you a few of them. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis weighing in on this new news that President Biden has stepped down from this election 2024 ticket. He accused Harris of being among individuals who weren't honest with the American people about Biden's ability to serve as president. South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem said Biden made the right decision. She also said whoever ends up leading the Democratic ticket will still have to defend Biden's policies. And then North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum, he was a finalist to join Trump on that GOP ticket, if you remember. He called Biden's announcement an early defeat for Democrats. Burgum said, "It doesn't matter which Democrat leads the ticket going forward because we have President Trump at the top of our ticket, and he is stronger than ever." And of course, President Trump, former President Trump, coming off of that assassination attempt just last week. It's hard to think that that was last week's news. This is this week's news. We saw Republicans, as you mentioned, full steam ahead at the RNC that just took place in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and some of them wearing patches on their ears to show their support for Donald Trump. As you can see, as we just read, Republicans, they are still standing behind their candidate, saying it doesn't matter who you bring forward. We have the guy for the job. We have the guy to unite the country. And that's the question, is whether or not Vice President Kamala Harris is going to be the person to unite the country or if it's going to be another Democrat.
Yeah, and that's the big question. Obviously, we talked about momentum a lot today. Kamala Harris obviously running with the momentum as people probably expected her to see. We already read her statement a few times. I'm sure we'll circle back to that again. President Joe Biden gave her an endorsement. Several other prominent Democrats giving her an endorsement. We're about to read a statement from Mark Warner right there of Virginia. Powerful voice within the party. Within that statement, he gives his endorsement to Harris. Like you were saying, Sheeta, though, it's about the money. That's a critical factor. You can't win an election without money. She has her hands on it, already has, as Josh has enlightened us as well, moving ahead with that. So, you know, obviously the Democrats know they can't wait till 3 weeks in Chicago to know what the plan is.
And I think the one thing we can all agree on is that the Biden campaign certainly knows, the Biden-Harris campaign knows how to raise some money.
Right.
Even Donald Trump has criticized it. He said, I don't even know where all that money is coming from. They have so much of it. So that's kind of the front runner. That's another reason why she's the front runner. It'd be the easiest option. It would ruffle the least amount of feathers.
Right. And, you know, Donald Trump also no stranger to raising money. He's raising a lot of money right now, too. Biggest donor right now, at least I can think off the top of my head, Elon Musk said he's going to give him $45 million a month. So, you know, he can't talk too much about thin pockets as well. But obviously, you know, Democrats want to make sure they get the donors back on board because they had said we're going to freeze all this money for not only Joe Biden, but also for people down ticket as well. That was a big problem and a big pressure thing. That's why you saw a lot of these lawmakers really coming out, really being forced to come out and say, hey, I'm either riding with him or I'm not. And obviously that pressure broke the dam for Joe Biden.
And one of the people that was riding with him, at least in the public eye, was Nancy Pelosi. She is just now giving her statement. She says, in part, President Joe Biden is a patriotic American who has always put our country first. His legacy of vision, values, and leadership make him one of the most consequential presidents in American history. with love and gratitude to President Biden for always believing to the promise of America and giving people the opportunity to reach their fulfillment. God bless America with Joe Biden's greatness and goodness. That was Nancy Pelosi there. As we know, Nancy Pelosi is actually a little bit older than President Biden, but even she has said it is time to hang it up. It's time to step aside. And we know that she stepped aside from her position as Speaker just years ago. So she knows what it's like to have this amount of pride and to be able to say, you know what, this is what's best for the country.
And U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar also reacting now. President Biden has served with integrity and delivered results that will strengthen our country for generations to come. He passed historic legislation investing in our infrastructure, manufacturing, and lowering the cost of prescription drugs. I'm deeply grateful for his service, dedication, and commitment to our country and our democracy. President Biden is choosing the honorable path today, something people have really been calling for.
Yeah, and with President Biden's announcement, the move, it creates a vacuum in the Democratic Party with fewer than 5 months to crown a successor.
But as politics play out on the national stage in real time, we wanted to take a look back at the events of the last 3 weeks and how they sealed the president's fate. Molly Martinez has a story.
A shaky debate performance on June 27th set in motion a series of events that destabilized the Biden reelection campaign. In an effort to do immediate damage control, 1 week later, the president agreed to a sit-down interview with George Stephanopoulos.
If the Lord Almighty came down and said, Joe, get out of the race, I'd get out of the race. The Lord Almighty's not coming down.
The interview did little to quell the growing anxiety in the party, with several congressional members calling for the president to bow out.
The President of the United States doesn't have the vigor necessary to overcome the deficit.
Now, celebrities were getting involved, with friend and mega donor George Clooney penning an op-ed in the New York Times that the president was unfit to serve another term. On July 11th, following the NATO summit in Washington, D.C., the president put himself in the hot seat, hosting his first ever solo press conference in 8 months. The attempt to show off his acumen for foreign policy was eclipsed by this gaffe.
I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president.
The redemption tour continued, despite a growing chorus of members of his own party calling for a replacement. Then, the event no one could have predicted. This stunning, pivotal moment catapulted support for Donald Trump and forced many to take an even harder look, not just at Joe Biden's viability as a candidate, but the survivability of the party with important congressional and Senate races at stake. In the days after the attempted assassination, reports grew of high-ranking Democrats, including Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi and former President Barack Obama, asking for intervention. These calls were heated, with Biden announcing it's time to pass the torch. We're still a month out from the DNC, where the party faces a reckoning of identity and leadership. In Washington, I'm Molly Martinez.
You know, and President Joe Biden has made history just months ahead of November's election, 107 days to be exact, not much time at all. But the big question now, who will Democrats choose as his replacement, and how will this play out? You know,
I mean, that's a question that all of us have, is how is this going to play out? What comes next? We are just a few weeks away.
I know a lot of people have been reacting, both sides of the aisle. People have different thoughts about what should happen next, how it should happen, thoughts on how things are happening, specifically when we're talking about the GOP. Now, we could have probably guessed that they were going to attack President Biden, saying he shouldn't be in office right now if he can't run for an election. We've heard him say, hey, people voted for Joe Biden, but now all of a sudden he's not on the ticket anymore thanks to pressure by Democrats. So it's been really interesting to see the reactions.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the question, though. Are they going to focus their efforts on attacking Biden, who has now stepped aside? Are they going to focus their attention on Kamala Harris and saying, look, these are all the bad things that your administration that you were a part of already did, and this is why I'm better for the country? Or are they going to focus on their message that was at the RNC, which was unifying the country? That's really the question that I have, is what comes next, just like everyone else.
Right, and we had on Amber McReynolds just a little bit ago talking about, what independent voters are thinking. Because really when it all boils down, it's independent voters in about 7 states who are going to make the difference for the most part if the numbers in the polls stay the same. You know, the blue wall, Michigan, Wisconsin, where the RNC just was, understandably so, Pennsylvania, places like there. it's independent voters there who are going to sway the election one way or the other. So it's really, what are they thinking? She gave us great insight. She likes the fact that independent voters are getting some power.
She mentioned that she's an independent herself, but she was the first, I believe, independent that was appointed by President Biden in his administration. She talked about this is probably the most independent voters we've ever had in history.
Young, too.
Exactly, young voters. And a lot of the younger people, they're saying now's the time for change. I think historically we've seen Democrats and Republicans do things a little bit more traditionally. And I think there are a lot more independents now, a lot more free thinkers. People don't want to be tied to a party. They don't like this person's policy. They don't. And what's interesting about this particular year is that at least whenever Biden was still in the race, he and Trump had both been president. So we had something to go off of. It's going to be interesting to see if Kamala Harris distances herself from some of the things or if she just champions them instead.
And it's interesting. I was at the White House literally yesterday, and there was a protest. Obviously, now their questions are answered. They were saying, pass the torch, Joe Biden. That was the whole point of the protest. A lot of young people, probably about 50 people out there, and it was in the rain too, so they weren't out there fair weather. They're out there serious. Hey, Joe Biden, thank you, but it's time to go. That was their message, and they love his record. Like many Democrats have already come out and said, he's done great things, they'll tell you, in his first 4 years, but they say the next 4 are not for you, most importantly, because we can't afford to lose this. That's what Democrats are saying. We can't afford to lose to Donald Trump in November, to turn back all the hard work that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, quite frankly, have done in the past 4 years, and also turn it back from years beyond that. For example, the Roe v. Wade decision, they blame a lot of that on Trump as well. And so we're also hearing from lawmakers across the country, including some Democrat delegates from Tennessee.
Yeah, this includes Nashville Mayor Freddie O'Connell, who says the move was completely unexpected based on the communications delegates had with the Biden administration leading up to the convention, but that he now supports Vice President Kamala Harris for the presidential nominee.
And Representative Afton Ben says it was the move she was hoping for. She says she wanted to see a new era of leadership and that she supports any female or minority candidate put up for the Democratic Party.
I will say, even coming into this weekend, we were hearing from the administration very active. They remain very active. I was very surprised by it, but I appreciate the president's service to the country, and I appreciate the ways he supported us as a city very, very much.
I'm the only Tennessee Democrat to publicly call for Biden to step down. I welcome the decision, and I'm excited to see what happens in the next few weeks.
Tennessee Democrats held a meeting this afternoon on the heels of President Biden's announcement.
And Vice President Kamala Harris, the woman we've been talking about a lot lately, current vice president, top pick to be nominee, released a statement saying, we want to read it, saying that on behalf of the American people, I thank Joe Biden for his extraordinary leadership as president of the United States and for his decades of service to our country. His remarkable legacy of accomplishment is unmatched in modern American history, surpassing the legacy of many presidents who have served 2 terms in office.
And she adds, it is a profound honor to serve as his vice president. And she continued that statement saying that, she's willing to take on this vice president or this presidential nomination coming up at the DNC, but that she wants to earn the delegates' votes.
Yeah, and that's been a big thing with voters I've been talking to in particular. They say, yeah, Kamala Harris, obviously next up being vice president, but they want someone who can win, and that way they want a little bit more competition. That's something that the DNC hasn't had in the previous election cycles here. I know Peter Zampa here is going to join us here in 1 second. He's in New York. He's joining us back now. He's been with us all day long. And Peter, we're going to have a couple more questions for you. We see Kamala Harris stepping up, obviously saying she wants to be president, already taken over, starting to get her hands on the money that she already has access to some. Talk about how quickly things are moving and how quickly, quite frankly, they need to be moving if Democrats want a chance in November.
Yeah, Ryan, let's dig into all of that. So let's start with the money portion. We already have seen filings that she's started this Biden for President Fund, Biden Baldwin for President Fund, all these different funds. And when you go to click on them, at least a couple of them we know so far, if you click on them, they still say Biden. They don't say Harris. So she's trying to change this, or that gives the appearance that they are just converting this campaign, as was expected, from the Biden-Harris campaign to the Harris, whoever she picks campaign. So all those coffers that we know were deep for President Biden will now theoretically transfer over to Kamala Harris. Now, will there be some stink raised from Republicans? A strategist I'm speaking to expects that, and he expects some controversy over just allowing this war chest to transfer over. But it would naturally make sense if some of this was in a political action committee that was headed to Harris anyway, even though as vice president, it would make sense that it would transfer to her. And if not, there is this idea that they could probably transfer it into another PAC from this one that was under Biden's name. So we already see that in motion. As far as how quickly they need to work, we've been talking about this all day, but it's important for them to show that they are not the party of chaos, and not just to the American people, but also to donors. So that's why this is really a double-edged sword as to how quickly they move. On one edge of this sword, they need to show the American people, specifically the Democrats that voted in these primaries, that this is a fair and free process, that it's just not just going to her, that she's not just anointed by President Biden. All of a sudden, she's the nominee. And she's also made it clear that she wants to earn this nomination. But on the other hand, she needs to earn this nomination quickly. They need to make it clear that they have a ticket, that they're not still waiting for a ticket, to show these big money donors who are starting to dry up for President Biden that they should come back in because they have a true positive ticket that they know will be on the November ballot. So they need to move quick, but not too quick, so as to show that this is an undemocratic process.
Yeah, and since we last spoke to you, we just read Nancy Pelosi's statement. She went on to talk about how President Biden is a patriotic American who always puts our country first, but she did not give the endorsement that maybe a lot of people were looking for Vice President Kamala Harris to step in. Talk a little bit about, weigh in on that. I mean, how big of an endorsement would that be if former Speaker Nancy Pelosi does come forward and say, hey, Kamala Harris is who we need to put our support behind? If Nancy Pelosi or any other top Democratic officials come forward, how big is their endorsement?
Yeah, and former President Barack Obama also did not endorse. And look, if you want to talk more about unifying this party, it needs to happen quickly. But they also, one of the main criticisms they're receiving from the other side of this, and I'm sure will resonate with a lot of Americans, including those Democratic voters in the primaries, is we can't just be picking and choosing our politicians. Conspiracy theories are flying that this was always the plan and that they knew they would be able to get an undemocratically elected Democrat on the ticket in November. They want to try to shy away from that and show that this is a process that will yield the results under the will of the people. However, looking at all of the unification and the support surrounding Kamala Harris right now, the calculation from someone like Speaker Pelosi and someone like former President Barack Obama may be, it's going to be Harris, but we need to make it look like this all happened pretty organically and that she was not just handpicked, even though she is the natural successor. I mean, that's how vice presidents work, and it's how former President Barack Obama's vice president came to be president of the United States. That is generally the pecking order in these things, but they want it to be clear that it's democratically elected and not just chosen by high-up politicians.
Yeah, Republicans, just like Democrats, weighing in on this breaking news that President Biden is stepping aside. Now, one thing I thought was interesting is that, you know, Republicans, they're coming off of the RNC. There's a lot of gusto behind them. Let me just read you North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum. He said, we have President Trump at the top of our ticket. He's stronger than ever. He goes on to talk about how it really doesn't matter who's going to be at the top of the Democratic ballot because they have Donald Trump. Talk about the support that's coming out of the RNC, maybe some of that gusto that's coming fresh off of the RNC that happened in Milwaukee just last week. Talk about the Republican side and how they're not really wavered by whoever comes up on that ticket.
Yeah, so Rashida, objectively from a lot of experts, they thought that the RNC went very, very well. Now, Donald Trump's speech maybe went a little long for some people's liking, but overall, they did see that unified Republican Party that maybe wasn't present earlier this year or even for the last couple of years, ever since January 6th. You saw a lot of fracturing, but right now, it is the most unified I've ever seen this party from covering Capitol Hill. So that tells you something after almost a decade that these folks are together right now. But also after having covered a couple of conventions in the past, Rashida, you always get that bump. So if it was Republicans or Democrats last week, you're always going to get that momentum. And it reflects in the polls as well. It always shows that party, with all the speeches and just a captive audience for a week straight, primetime news, yes, you are going to get that positive bump out of a convention like that. So frankly, for Republicans, this is probably the last time that they wanted to see this announcement come, because they know things could easily shift back in Democratic favor. I mean, it's looking back at past conventions, it's rare that you see the Democrats at the absolute lowest point and Republicans at their absolute highest point at the exact same time. Now, it was luck for the Republicans for it to coincide like that. So for this to kind of shift momentum a little bit back in Democrats' favor, showing that they're no longer in disarray, that they are starting to come behind a clear ticket. And now that hasn't fully happened yet, but it's clear the signs are on the wall that it is hewing that way for Democrats. We'll see if they can really capitalize on this momentum, stealing a little bit of it away from Republicans.
And Peter, you know, we've heard a lot from party leadership on the Democratic side, but how important is it for voters to be a part of this democratic process, especially as whoever the nominee will be, Kamala Harris or otherwise, you know, gets to the top of the ticket?
Well, and I think that's a question viewers are asking themselves right now. I voted for someone, if you were voting in a Democratic primary, and now that person's not doing this and they're just going to choose someone else for me? How does that work? Now, in this situation, it's not like Joe Biden endorsed Gavin Newsom or Gretchen Whitmer, and it's someone that wasn't even in this sphere to begin with, and now all of a sudden they're top of the ticket. This is someone they basically, as a byproduct, did vote for in Kamala Harris, which is why you may see a lot of delegates who are going to the convention feel completely comfortable transferring that vote from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris. But some others might say, no, I really did want Joe Biden at the top of that ticket, and I did not count on Kamala Harris being the president of the United States potentially. So I think we should do all of this over again. These are legitimate questions that could lead to an open convention and are likely why you have people like Barack Obama and Nancy Pelosi kind of pulling back a little bit. They want to see this happen organically. Now, again, the organic result of this right now appears like it would easily be Kamala Harris, given how widely respected she is in the Democratic Party and how much support she clearly has from leaders top to bottom on Capitol Hill and elsewhere.
All right, Peter, we're just getting breaking news that Kamala Harris is officially a nominee for President of the United States. We want you to react to this. Tell us a little bit about, you know, just the reaction. I mean, it
comes
hard
in minute by minute.
I mean, it's coming in. It's hard to believe that this is the day that we're in, but talk a little bit about that. Now she is officially.
So you're just breaking this news to me now. I think I need more information before I do comment on that. How did they go through this nominating process? Let me turn it back on to you.
Yeah, so just to give you more information, the letter is to inform you. I'm just going to read it kind of as we're getting it right now. This letter is to inform you that Vice President Kamala Harris is no longer a candidate in the 2024 election for Vice President. Vice President Harris is now a candidate for U.S. President in the 2024 election and will henceforth be conducting campaign activities only in pursuit of that office. This committee statement of organization and the statement of candidacy are being amended accordingly. I know, Peter, we were talking earlier today about how fast she was getting her hands on the money. I mean, Peter, you were saying it. The website can't even change as fast as they're moving, trying to get access to the funds to continue to hit the ground running, literally, as they try and catch up to the Republicans and Donald Trump. You know, talk to people about how fast this process is going to move, even though it is incredibly complex.
It really is. And we saw her filings with the FEC earlier, just a few minutes ago, hours ago. Again, time doesn't exist right now, but this is moving very quickly. And, it couldn't move quicker than this as far as the days preceding this, because Joe Biden, until yesterday, was saying he's in this. He wants to fight and win this still. But as of now, Kamala Harris had to move very quickly. You know, she may have had things in order depending on when she was actually notified of this move and notified of President Biden's support for her. But as soon as that happens, again, time is of the essence, Ryan and Rashida. We've been talking about this. They need to move quick because their campaign season is shortened. And that's really why any outsider that was hoping to get in this who may not have the name recognition really did not make sense, especially getting into a race when all the momentum was on the other side. It's a really difficult task for anyone but Vice President Kamala Harris, now presidential candidate Kamala Harris. So yeah, she wants to get those filings underway for legal reasons, for monetary reasons, and to show those donors that she is a candidate for president. But that's not to say someone else might not emerge. It does not appear likely at this point. But right now, Kamala Harris clearly full speed ahead, and now she'll have to get her team together, likely stealing people from the Biden team, maybe a few of her own personal team members in there who have been doing a lot of work for her to make sure that this campaign is a well-oiled machine and continues to rake in the cash that we've seen President Biden do very successfully this cycle.
Yeah, I mean, weigh in a little bit. This comes at an inopportune time for President Biden as he has COVID. Earlier this week, we had breaking news that he had COVID. And a couple weeks ago, Hunter Biden found guilty of federal charges. He purchased a gun while being an addict. He was convicted of that. How much of a role do you think family had in Biden saying, you know what, I'm going to step aside. I'm 81 years old. He's, I'm sure, sick. He's been quarantined or whatever he's doing at this moment. But talk about how much family may have played a role in this decision for him.
Well, Rashida, I'll even turn that on the other side. Family reportedly was one of the reasons he was staying in this race, because his wife thought he could do this, that he was a great president and that he could be a great president for another 4 years. Now, the political winds were really blowing against him. So it's not clear how much family actually had to do with this. Of course, his son's legal woes are an issue that will, by the way, no longer be an issue on the campaign trail. That's something Republicans are probably not happy about. But yes, he is getting older, and you can clearly see that the walls were closing in on him, not necessarily health-wise, but politically for sure. And again, we cannot stress this enough. It's one thing to hear these voices, and it's another thing to see the dollar signs start to go away. And that was the trend, and that is an unsustainable trend in big politics, especially consider how much money he was bringing in for so much of this cycle, leading Donald Trump by a lot. Donald Trump had all of these financial problems. He was going to have to figure out how to pay off his legal woes, all of these different things. He was struggling financially. And now things are completely changed for the Republicans. It was almost like they just went in complete opposite directions. That's not sustainable for Democrats. Everything is already in Donald Trump's favor right now. They cannot afford to keep losing big donors. So getting a ticket that is a sure thing for Democrats, they know what they're going to get. They know what to expect. A younger ticket, a more energized ticket, one that might do better in a second debate against Donald Trump. That is exactly what they needed to show politicians, but also mainly those big donors.
That's LNL Senior National Correspondent Peter Zampa. Peter, thank you so much. I know you've covered Congress, D.C., the White House, and everything for years, so your expertise is very much appreciated.
Thank you.
And we're just going to recap now that we're at the top of the hour, just the breaking news we've been covering since about 1:46 p.m. this afternoon. President Joe Biden stepping out of the 2024 election. I'm Ryan Henson.
And I'm Rashida Kaba. President Biden has announced he will drop out of the 2024 presidential election and endorse his Vice President Kamala Harris as the Democrats' nominee. Just moments ago, the Federal Election Commission says Harris now is a candidate for United States president in the 2024 election.
And this comes after Democrats pushed him and his campaign team to drop out of the race, fearing his ability to win in November. The president insisted for weeks he would not back down. Even on Friday, he said after he gets over COVID this weekend, he was going to be campaigning tomorrow on Monday. Obviously, that's not the case anymore. He said repeatedly he feels he's the best candidate to beat Republican Donald Trump. Now he's got to turn the reins over.
Yeah, the calls for Biden to step aside grew significantly following his dismal debate performance against Donald Trump in that CNN presidential debate. Both publicly and privately, several Democrats, more high profile in the recent days, have called on Biden to drop his reelection bid. Here's a statement from President Biden earlier today. Take a look at it. And the Biden campaign, he talked a little bit about it on X. That's where the news broke.
He posted that letter on X.
It kind of shows you the times that we're in right now. And he went on to say, he's thankful that he's had this time in the White House and that he's done his best and that he continues to do his best for the American people, but that he's going to step aside.
Yeah, here's a statement that he said. My fellow Democrats, I have decided not to accept the nomination and to focus all my energies on my duties as president for the remainder of my term. My very first decision as party nominee in 2020 was to pick Kamala Harris as my vice president, and it's been the best decision I've made. Today, I want to offer my full support and endorsement for Kamala to be the nominee of our party this year. Democrats, it's time to come together and beat Trump. Let's do this. So obviously, after that announcement right there, the move creates a vacuum in the Democratic Party with fewer than 5 months to crown a successor, even though Kamala Harris seems to be in the front runner seat right now, and she's officially in it.
Yeah, but as politics play out on the national stage in real time, we wanted to take a look back at the events of the last 3 weeks. We know there have been many, and how they sealed the president's fate. Molly Martinez has the story.
Performance on June 27th set in motion a series of events that destabilized the Biden reelection campaign. In an effort to do immediate damage control, 1 week later, the president agreed to a sit-down interview with George Stephanopoulos.
If the Lord Almighty came down and said, Joe, get out of the race, I'll get out of the race. The Lord Almighty's not coming down.
The interview did little to quell the growing anxiety in the party, with several congressional members calling for the president to bow out.
The president of the United States doesn't have the vigor necessary to overcome the deficit.
Now, celebrities were getting involved, with friend and mega donor George Clooney penning an op-ed in the New York Times that the president was unfit to serve another term. On July 11th, following the NATO summit in Washington, D.C., the president put himself in the hot seat, hosting his first ever solo press conference in 8 months. The attempt to show off his acumen for foreign policy was eclipsed by this gaffe.
I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president.
The redemption tour continued, despite a growing chorus of members of his own party calling for a replacement. Then, the event no one could have predicted. This stunning, pivotal moment catapulted support for Donald Trump and forced many to take an even harder look, not just at Joe Biden's viability as a candidate, but the survivability of the party with important congressional and Senate races at stake. In the days after the attempted assassination, reports grew of high-ranking Democrats, including Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi and former President Barack Obama, asking for intervention. These calls were heated, with Biden announcing it's time to pass the torch. We're still a month out from the DNC, where the party faces a reckoning of identity and leadership. In Washington, I'm Molly Martinez.
Now, Vice President Kamala Harris released this statement saying, quote, on behalf of the American people, I thank Joe Biden for his extraordinary leadership as President of the United States and for his decades of service to our country. His remarkable legacy of accomplishment is unmatched in modern American history, surpassing the legacy of many presidents who have served 2 terms in office.
She adds, it is a profound honor to serve as his vice president. And joining us now is White House correspondent John Decker. John, we've had some new developments since we last spoke. The Federal Election Commission now saying that Kamala Harris has officially started to run for president of the United States. What's your reaction to this?
Well, it's not surprising. That's dotting the I's and crossing the T's. You can't just make an announcement outwardly without taking these formal steps. The formal steps have now been taken. And this is important. It's important in several ways. It's important, most importantly, in terms of fundraising. It's an important aspect of any presidential campaign. You could even argue it's the most important aspect of a presidential campaign. This will allow the Biden-Harris campaign to transfer funds to the Harris for President campaign, and it will allow the process to go forward as far as fundraising and fundraisers are concerned. The Vice President has a lot on her plate right now. She needs to unify her party. She needs to do that fundraising, which is so important. And she needs to make certain that she has a viable, strong running mate in terms of winning in these key battleground states. That's a lot on the plate with 107 days to go until November the 5th. That's Election Day.
And John, I know we talked a lot today about momentum, her moving so quickly, especially, putting her name on the paper and getting her hands on the money and putting out statements. How much does that mean in terms of her being the nominee at the end of the DNC in Chicago next month?
Oh, it's so important. 3 weeks away, that's when the Democratic National Convention in Chicago gets underway. And you really want to make certain that all of your ducks are in a row before that convention begins. And we'll see if indeed that happens. And I say if indeed that happens, because although you have President Biden endorsing the vice president, you have Bill and Hillary Clinton endorsing the vice president to be the Democratic standard bearer, you don't have former President Barack Obama endorsing Kamala Harris just yet. In fact, he put out a statement essentially saying that he would like to see an open primary process during the convention to determine who the standard bearer for the Democratic Party will be in November.
And John, her moving so quickly, does that effectively ice out anybody else who could throw their name in the hat? Or is there still time and to see that open convention like former President Barack Obama wants to see?
Ryan, it's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. No one knows the answer to that. There are so many individuals within the Democratic Party who do have presidential ambitions. Think about it this way, Ryan. Think about all the Democrats that ran in 2020. All of them still have those same presidential ambitions. And the question is, do any of those sitting Democratic governors, do they put their ambitions aside and coalesce around Kamala Harris? We'll have to wait and see over the next 24 to 48 hours. They need to get their ducks in a row if indeed they're going to challenge her. Make certain that they have the fundraising apparatus in place, that they have the campaign apparatus in place, because it's now essentially going to be subsumed by the Harris for President campaign. And so as a result, she has that head start in terms of those key endorsements coming from President Biden, from former President Bill Clinton, from Hillary Clinton. These are the leaders of the Democratic Party.
One thing that we've noticed that has been the same tune for a lot of Democrats is them saying, President Biden is a patriot. He's putting service and country above self. Talk about the legacy that he leaves behind after he leaves office come November. He's passed a lot of bills. He's helped a lot of people. We can't ignore that. Talk about the legacy the Biden-Harris administration has.
Well, he does have a legacy. He was successful in passing some meaningful, long-lasting legislation. You think about the bipartisan infrastructure law that was signed into law in the first year of President Biden's time in office. That is one of those legacy items, because those projects, those infrastructure projects, will be going on long after President Biden leaves office. You have, in addition to that, a Supreme Court justice who potentially will be on the U.S. Supreme Court for decades. That is a lasting legacy item. The CHIPS Act, also important as far as trying to continue on with economic policies which would benefit the tech sector in America. So certainly President Biden does have substantial accomplishments that he can point to during the course of his 4 years in office. That being said, those accomplishments were not enough to stop the onslaught of Democrat after Democrat in Congress from calling on him to step aside, to bow out of the race to be the Democratic nominee this election cycle.
And you mentioned it a little bit, you touched on it briefly, when it comes to other nominees that could come forward outside of Kamala Harris. Talk about some of the difficulties they could potentially face outside of money, as we are just 3.5 weeks away from the Democratic National Convention.
Well, Rashida, it is often said that money is the mother's milk of politics, and it's true. You can't simply throw your hat in the ring and hope that money follows your candidacy. You have to have that fundraising apparatus in place. And there are very few candidates who would potentially challenge the vice president who have that kind of apparatus, a national campaign fundraising apparatus in place. There's Gavin Newsom of California. He potentially has that right now, but it's one of those things where how do you challenge the person who right now has the head start, the sitting vice president? And let's not forget, She's from California, like Gavin Newsom is from California. That would be very interesting if indeed that occurred. I think what is likely to happen, leaving aside what President Barack Obama has decided to do, leaving him out of the picture just for a moment, I think that what we're likely to see is a coalescing of the Democratic Party around Kamala Harris's candidacy. And that would mean that the real focus, I believe, over the course of the next week will focus on who would be a very strong running mate for the vice president to help in these key battleground states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada. Those are the states which will determine who wins the White House in 2024.
And John, you know, if former President Joe Biden, well, not former President Joe Biden, he's still current president, President Biden campaigns for Kamala Harris and says she is the nominee, would that help or hurt her, especially given that Democrats, for the most part, really love what he's done the past 3.5 years, and Republicans seem to be absolutely hating it? What will it do if he went to the campaign trail to help her?
Well, that's a great question, Ryan. I don't know the answer to that. I never viewed President Biden as a particularly great campaigner. To me, the best campaigner in the Democratic Party is former President Barack Obama. He is a successful two-term president. We saw how hard he worked in the last election cycle, even with the pandemic going on, campaigning for President Biden in Philadelphia, in Atlanta, in Milwaukee, in Madison, Wisconsin. These are the important places to get out the Democratic vote. And so he will be critical in terms of helping out the vice president, if indeed she is the nominee, and it looks like she likely will be in November.
All right, John, we know you are traveling. White House correspondent John Decker, we appreciate you taking time out of your travel to give us some really valuable insight here on this very momentous day in Washington, D.C.
Thanks, Rashida.
So as we continue to cover this breaking news of President Biden stepping out of the 2024 race, we talked a lot about Democrats, talked a lot about who's next, but people in the GOP have plenty to say, including his political rival, Donald Trump. Trump campaign released a statement. I'll read it right here. Joe Biden, quote unquote, cannot take himself out of a campaign for president because he is too mentally incompetent and still remain in the White House. Biden is a national security threat in great cognitive decline and a clear and present danger to every man, woman, and child in our country. The question then to Kamala Harris is simple. Knowing that Joe Biden withdrew from the campaign because of his rapidly deteriorating condition, does Harris believe the people of America are safe and secure with Joe Biden in the White House for 6 more months?
Of course, Donald Trump not taking any words, not sparing any words. Of
Right.
course, we wouldn't expect anything less. And we know his vice presidential running mate, J.D. Vance from Ohio, he's also weighing in on all of this. He shared this. He said, Joe Biden has been the worst president in my lifetime, and Kamala Harris has been right there with him every step of the way. Over the last 4 years, she co-signed Biden's open border and green scam policies that drove up the cost of housing and groceries. She owns all of these failures. She lied for nearly 4 years about Biden's mental capacity, saddling the nation with a president who can't do the job. President Trump and I are ready to save America. Whoever's at the top of the Democrat ticket, bring it on. You can hear there's still some words that are going around. They're not happy that I don't think that Kamala Harris is coming forward, but They're saying this is no different. We're not going to change our game plan. This is the exact same game plan that we came in to beat the Biden-Harris administration.
I mean, I think they're using it the same way Democrats are. Democrats trying to rally around a candidate. You've heard a lot of people endorse Kamala Harris. Republicans saying, hey, this is a chance for us to attack Democrats, attack the party, attack Joe Biden, as he has just now, we know, a couple more months left in office, attack Kamala Harris, who's trying to win 4 more years, and attack the party as a whole, saying, hey, they don't know what they're doing. We do. Trust us. We're the guys to help save America, quote unquote. And, it's politics. That's exactly what they're doing.
If you're just joining us, the breaking news that has come down, we've had many different aspects of this breaking news, starting off with around 1:45. President Biden saying, you know what, I'm going to step out of election 2024, and I am now going to pass this on to my vice president, Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris has officially begun running for president. According to the Federal Election Commission, they have said she's no longer a vice presidential candidate, but a presidential candidate. And we've seen so many different lawmakers come forward on the Democratic, Republican side weighing in on this. Trump is still the GOP's candidate. They're saying we don't care who comes at the top of that ballot. We're going to beat them. And, you know, a lot of people on Biden's side are saying, you know what? Regardless, we need to rally behind one person. The easiest person that would be to rally behind, Kamala Harris, being that campaign funds are in her favor.
And, you know, we're taking a live look right now at the calm outside of the White House. I can only imagine how frantic it is on the inside right there. But let's talk about the inside of Joe Biden's family right now. We're getting reaction from Hunter Biden, who we all know is his son, and he's awaiting sentencing after recently being convicted of a felony gun charge. So the president's son said his father is a quote unique figure in public life and asked Americans to thank him. Hunter Biden also goes on to say that the president's unconditional love, quote unquote, has been a North Star for his father as president and as a parent, and that there is no distance between the two. He said he's lucky that he gets to tell his dad every day that he loves him and to thank him. He asked the public to join him in doing the same. And I think that sentiment of thank you, Joe Biden, echoes really across the party. I told you I was out there yesterday with protesters who wanted Joe Biden off the ticket. The first thing they said was, thank you, Joe Biden.
Yeah.
Then they said, get off the ticket.
Yeah.
You know, the one thing a lot of these Democratic lawmakers are coming out and saying, I know they're not using Kamala Harris's name or not, but the one thing they are using, thank you, Joe Biden. So Democrats obviously in full support of Joe Biden and the work he's done over the past 3.5 years and the rest of the work he's going to do for the next couple of months while he remains in the White House.
Yeah, and we're all standing by. We're getting word that President Biden is going to be addressing the nation at some point this week. We don't have a specific timeline, but we can only imagine what he's going to say. I'm sure he will talk about, you know, the successes that he's had, the legacy that he leaves behind, his endorsement for Kamala Harris.
Right.
You have to expect that those are some of the things that he'll address.
And remember, you know, to keep this in human terms here, Joe Biden is recovering from COVID right now. He's been recovering for the past couple of days. Obviously, we know how COVID impacts older adults. So the doctor this morning said he is doing much better today, but obviously this is some weight off his shoulders nonetheless. Yeah. But Republicans are saying, hey, we're going to take this time to go after the Democrats, like we're saying. Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson saying in part, quote, having invalidated the votes of more than 14 million Americans who selected Joe Biden to be the Democrat nominee for president, the self-proclaimed party of democracy has proven exactly the opposite. The party's prospects are no better now with Vice President Kamala Harris, who co-owns the disastrous policy failures of the Biden administration. As second in command and completely inept border czar, Harris has been a gleeful accomplice not only in the destruction of American sovereignty, security, and prosperity, but also in the largest political cover-up in U.S. history. She is known for as long as anyone of his incapacity to serve. That is House Speaker Mike Johnson, who's interesting enough coming with the stinging words, especially as someone who's a leader of the GOP. But if you remember back in the fall, when the roles were reversed, Republicans in disarray, we don't know who's going to be House Speaker. Mike Johnson was selected because he was seen as the most divisive, the least divisive out of all the other candidates who were throwing their names in the hat. Now he's definitely using this opportunity to come on, play politics some, but also call out something that other people, even some pundits to a degree, have echoed that, hey, Joe Biden's name was at the top of the ticket. No,
a lot of people in that CNN presidential debate, what's being known as the disastrous debate, that's when a lot of people have said, hey, wait a minute. We have been hearing these talks of Biden's decline, but none of you guys confirmed it. Some people kind of angry about it, saying, hey, you tricked us. Right. Now we're in this type of situation, and it's August. We're just months away from the November election, and it is difficult to pivot. Of course, in years past, back in the day, they used to wait until the Democratic National Convention to come out and say, this is our nominee. Of course, what we're used to in our lifetime is having somebody, we know who's going to be at the DNC, and we know who's going to be running. This, very different.
Right. Our local journalists across the country are following this breaking news today and in South Carolina.
Yeah, that's where our station WIS hit the streets to hear from voters about their reaction to President Biden's decision. Here's what some of them had to say.
I was honestly really shocked. I didn't see that coming. I wanted it to come. I feel like it's, you know, not for any like policy reasons or anything, just because he's getting older. And, you know, the way he was acting during the debate was kind of insane.
Cool to see other ideas and other philosophies from other Democratic Party members. But I do think it's so close to the election that it really doesn't matter what happens. I think Trump's going to come home with it.
I think it's time to see someone new. I think it's time for them to take a step back and allow other people to be in the running with fresh ideas and better initiative.
You just heard it there. Some voters wanting another option, saying somebody should come in with some fresh ideas. We're also hearing from lawmakers across the country, including some Democratic delegates from Tennessee.
This includes Nashville Mayor Freddie O'Connell, who says the move was completely unexpected based on the communications delegates had with the Biden campaign leading up to the convention, but that now he supports Vice President Kamala Harris for the presidential nomination.
Representative Afton Ben says it was the move she was hoping for. She says she wanted to see a new era of leadership and that she supports any female or minority candidate put up for the Democratic Party.
I will say, even coming into this weekend, we were hearing from the administration very active. You know, they remain very active. I was very surprised by it, but I appreciate the president's service to the country, and I appreciate the ways he supported us as a city very, very much.
I'm the only Tennessee Democrat to publicly call for Biden to step down. I welcome the decision, and I'm excited to see what happens in the next few weeks.
As Tennessee Democrats held a meeting this afternoon on the heels of President Biden's announcement.
Now, members of Biden's cabinet are praising the president's legacy and his administration.
Yeah, so are many voters. Education Secretary Miguel Cardona said Biden fought to ensure that education is accessible and affordable for all students in communities across the nation.
Meantime, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg said Biden has earned his place among the best and most consequential presidents in American history. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said she was proud of the work and the administration and accomplished citing new jobs and economic growth.
Interior Secretary Deb Haaland said the administration had achieved transformational and historic change.
And with President Biden's announcement, the move, it certainly creates a vacuum in the Democratic Party with fewer than 5 months to crown a new successor.
But as politics play out on the national stage in real time, we wanted to take a look back at the events of the last 3 weeks and how they sealed the president's fate. Our Washington correspondent Molly Martinez has this report.
A shaky debate performance on June 27th set in motion a series of events that destabilized the Biden reelection campaign. In an effort to do immediate damage control, 1 week later, the president agreed to a sit-down interview with George Stephanopoulos.
If the Lord Almighty came down and said, Joe, get out of the race, I'll get out of the race. The Lord Almighty's not coming down.
The interview did little to quell the growing anxiety in the party, with several congressional members calling for the president to bow out.
The president of the United States doesn't have the vigor necessary to overcome the deficit.
Now, celebrities were getting involved, with friend and mega donor George Clooney penning an op-ed in the New York Times that the president was unfit to serve another term. On July 11th, following the NATO summit in Washington, D.C., the president put himself in the hot seat, hosting his first ever solo press conference in 8 months. The attempt to show off his acumen for foreign policy was eclipsed by this gaffe.
I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president.
The redemption tour continued, despite a growing chorus of members of his own party calling for a replacement. Then, the event no one could have predicted. This stunning, pivotal moment catapulted support for Donald Trump and forced many to take an even harder look, not just at Joe Biden's viability as a candidate, but the survivability of the party with important congressional and Senate races at stake. In the days after the attempted assassination, reports grew of high-ranking Democrats, including Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi and former President Barack Obama, asking for intervention. These calls were heated, with Biden announcing it's time to pass the torch. We're still a month out from the DNC, where the party faces a reckoning of identity and leadership. In Washington, I'm Molly Martinez.
And Ryan, I know you've had the opportunity to not only meet face-to-face with President Biden. One of the things we talked about earlier is some voters, they feel tricked. They feel like, we are in August, we're almost to August, just months away from the Democratic National Convention. We thought we had our nominee sealed in. And they said, the decline that Biden has, we've seen it publicly at this point. We heard about it privately here on the Hill, but publicly, some voters feel tricked. Talk a little bit about that. You've seen the president from the time that you met him the first time till now. What has been the difference?
I think I hadn't noticed any of that until he came out on that debate stage. I had never met that Joe Biden who was on the debate stage, the weekend before the 4th of July, whenever that was. A lot of times when he comes out and make public appearances, many times he's given the speech, he is that fiery Joe Biden, kind of yelling a little bit, you know what I mean? We saw it at State of the Union. We saw it at several other campaign events, even including the day after that disastrous debate. But I had never seen anything. I'd met him several, obviously been in the same room with him, met him once really, but been in the same room with him as he gave speeches where the cameras were off and did things like that. So definitely interesting to see that. Now we know another aspect too is going to be foreign affairs.
Yeah, foreign affairs is a huge one, and we're just now getting breaking news that Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, he is now weighing in on this. He said, "We respect today's tough but strong decision. We will always be thankful for President Biden's leadership. He supported our country during the most dramatic moment in history, assisted us in preventing Putin from occupying our country, and has continued to support us throughout this terrible war." Zelensky spoke with former President Trump over the phone on Friday. Both men described it as a good call. On X is where we just got this information from. It's formerly known as Twitter. This is going to be really big for even Volodymyr Zelensky over there in Ukraine, fighting off the Kremlin. Talk about that. I mean, how huge is this? But Biden has been championing to give them more money.
Right, $1 billion. A lot of people talk about giving Ukraine $1 billion. Republicans hate it.
Yeah.
Democrats unsure about it. It's a lot of money. But I think Zelensky, like everybody else, knows that if former President Donald Trump gets back in the White House, they're going to see a lot of support drop off. When Russia first invaded Ukraine, former President Donald Trump is quoted as saying, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but saying is, praising Vladimir Putin and saying he can do whatever they want with Ukraine. That was what former President Trump said about Ukraine when they were invaded by Russia, and that's still going on right now at the cost of many Ukrainian lives, unfortunately and sadly. So I'm sure Zelensky is nervous.
I was going to say, he's got to be a little bit nervous, a little bit scared. This is who he's built the relationship with. He's come to Capitol Hill multiple times to champion for his country. He's been able to always get the support of the American people. And then when you think about Donald Trump, his stance on Ukraine, his stance on being kind of friends with Putin in some ways, it makes you nervous if you're Vladimir Zelensky.
Yeah, and any Ukrainian. But we're now going to turn back home to local politicians in Alabama. Democratic Party leadership and others are responding to President Biden's big announcement today.
Yeah, all of them defended the Biden-Harris ticket until today, and now they're united under a new candidate, current Vice President Kamala Harris. Alabama Democratic Party Vice Chair Randy Kelly says the decision was not a shock to him. But the party's vice chair, Tabitha Eisner Sassy, she says that the decision was a shocking moment for the party. She endorses Vice President Harris as the next nominee. Alabama Democratic Conference Chair Joe Reed also endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris and wants her to continue some of Biden's policies relating to student loan forgiveness and public education. All three agree on how Biden's legacy will be viewed by future generations.
I think he'll be remembered as handling a lot of crises in a way that made it seem like they weren't crises at all. And I think that will be his great legacy, is that we didn't notice what a great job he was doing.
He saved democracy. When we look at the shenanigans of Trump, calling for an insurrection, and the lies that Trump told, Trump is a pathological liar.
And what they ought to write about him, that he was very good in foreign policy, he had good domestic issues, he stood by black folk, he put a black woman on the Supreme Court of the United States. So he got a wealth of things, too many to enunciate here.
Or speaking to President Biden's legacy there, commending him for stepping aside. And we're getting news that we're just now getting Montgomery, Alabama Mayor Stephen Reed. He is joining us now. He is president of the African American Mayors Association. He's been a vocal Biden supporter. What is your reaction to the news that just came out today? Just hours ago, we found out President Biden is stepping aside, endorsing his Vice President Kamala Harris in election 2024.
Oh, thank you all for having me. My reaction was probably like a lot of people around the country. I think it's one out of respect for what the president decided. It was his decision. I'm sure it was a tough decision for he and his family. I think it was an act of heroism. I think it was an act of patriotism. And I think that's what President Biden's life and public service has been for over 50 years. And I think he is the consummate American and one who wants to see the best for each and every American that he has represented, whether it was locally or in the U.S. Senate, and certainly as vice president and president.
And since this news broke, have you had a chance to speak to any other lawmakers or any other people in the Democratic Party that are having some opinions? What is the opinion? What is the consensus? Are they going to stand behind Vice President Kamala Harris?
Well, sure. I'm on a text thread with several mayors around the country of large and mid-sized and small cities, all who stand in solidarity to support Vice President Harris, in part because of what she has done in vice president, in part because what we believe she can do as president. Spoken with former mayors as well, who are supportive of this, who are energized. I've spoken with activists as well and faith leaders who are actively trying to figure out right now how they can refocus and get their communities engaged in this race and what's going to be a sprint between now and November.
And Mayor Reed, you run a blue city, obviously in a deep red state. How much is at stake this election? How important is it to at least have an ally in the White House?
It's urgently important for so many of us in our cities. I serve as the president of the African American Mayors Association, but also on the board of directors for the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And one of the things that we know is that President Biden has been a great, really transformational president for cities. And that's very, very important. The legislation, the policies, the options that he has given us to talk with he and his administration, unprecedented. And how he has leveraged government during the tough times of the last 4 years to help stay out of a recession, to help cities stay afloat, and really to help our states and our communities. So it is tremendously important for us, one, to get that message out, because I don't see President Biden as going off into the pasture, if you will. I see him going from CEO to maybe chair of the board. I think that he will have an active role in this campaign and talking about the policies that both he and Vice President Harris brought about to so many mayors and so many of our communities. And it's going to be up to us as mayors to be on the front line right there with Vice President Harris, talking about the future in the next 4 years under her leadership and why it's so urgently important that she be elected as president versus former President Trump and what he represents. He represents division. He represents taking America back to a time that really predates the gains of the civil rights movement. He really represents a fringe and extreme element that is hostile to cities, is hostile to the communities that we try to represent and we try to lead each and every day.
And Mayor Reed, you kind of led right into my next question. Black votes. The black vote is coveted by both parties, quite frankly. How important is it to make sure that, black communities as a whole get to the ballot box and reflect the things that they want to see, not only on a federal level, but a state and local level as well?
Well, the black vote may be, coveted by both parties, but only one party refers to black jobs. Only one party refers to their candidate as being relatable to a certain segment of black voters because he is a felon. Most black people that I know aren't felons. And so I think it's very important for us to understand the lens in which the Democratic Party views and appreciates the base of the party, which is the African-American vote, and how the Republican Party views that. And so when you consider the chance to make history again, which I don't know if any of us saw this coming, more than a few days ago, if ever, that's going to be significant but we have to talk about the issues that matter to Black voters. Symbolism is not enough. We will talk about the policies. We will talk about the substance that Vice President Harris brings to the table. We will talk about her experience, and we will talk about the work that she has done throughout her public career, her public service career as well. And I think there will be a stark difference between what Vice President Harris is bringing as a Democratic nominee, and certainly that of a Trump administration, one that represents extremism and Project 2025. I think that there's a clear line, and there will be understood that there's a clear choice that we have as African-American voters to come out in record numbers with record enthusiasm and energy and make sure that we get this country back on track from where it may be tipping right now. And I say right now because it's a long time between now and November, and make sure that we continue the policies in the administration of President Biden and Vice President Harris, and then under a President Harris administration. That's going to be key. And make no mistake about it, as the African-American mayors, we will be out there on the front lines, in our communities, in barbershops, in churches, in beauty salons, on the corners, in the neighborhoods, wherever we have to go to make sure we are telling the story of what this administration has done for us as mayors and what that has allowed us to do to represent our communities more often than not are majority Black and brown, and the difference that has made over these last 4 years. I cannot stress that enough. I cannot make that urgent plea enough, and we will continue to make that between now and November.
Yeah, and Mayor Reed, you mentioned symbolism is not enough, but for some people, that symbol of Vice President Kamala Harris running for president, being a Black woman, being a South Asian woman, talk about the difference it's going to make for some young girls. If we come August 19th and it's at the Democratic National Convention, and she is, in fact, the Democratic nominee for president, what kind of a difference is this going to make, not only in the history books, but for many people growing up knowing that this is something that's possible for them?
I have a daughter who certainly, I know this would make a difference, even though she's a young adult. But certainly for younger girls, I can only imagine what they may feel, in particular when you consider the disappointment after Secretary Hillary Clinton's close loss in 2016 to Donald Trump at the time. So to have this symbolism with a Supreme Court Justice, Ketanji Brown Jackson, to be able to see these examples and be able to see the realization of the rights of women advanced at this level, to see the advancement of civil rights and equality manifest in this. I can't put a number on it. I don't know if I can put a word to it. I just think it's one of those things that for so many of us who remember President Obama being sworn in 2009 after his victory in November of 2008, was something you just never forget. And it's that lasting image that truly, truly is there and truly matters to so many people of all backgrounds, not even just Black girls or Asian girls, but to so many girls and young women and older women as well. To see that, I can't imagine what it will mean. But I want to be very sure we don't plan, and I know Vice President Harris well enough to know how deep she is, how knowledgeable she is of economics and what it means to everyday Americans to be dealing in a world where inflation is sometimes making it harder for them to feel like they're, really increasing and getting a better chance at the American dream. She understands the everyday American problems. She understands what's happening and why foreign policy is so important and that we stick by our allies. She understands why it's important for healthcare to be more accessible, why it's important for a woman to have the right to choose. She understands these things in a way that beyond just the symbolism, that she brings the depth, the intellect, the charisma, and the substance that I believe so many people who have not fully been able to see her work and to see her lead will be encouraged to go out and support for her, to volunteer, and to take others to the polls to help make sure that she is the next president of the United States.
Montgomery, Alabama Mayor Stephen Reed, thank you so much for joining us, especially as I'm sure your phone is ringing off the hook. We appreciate you.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for having me.
Question now, who will Democrats choose as his replacement at the top of the ticket, and how will this all play out? Amber McReynolds is an American elections expert and independent voter. She was appointed by President Biden to serve as the first woman on the Postal Service Board of Governors. Amber, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, Amber, first off, your reaction to today's news.
Well, goodness, I can't imagine something, an announcement that is more politically courageous, humble, kind, and frankly demonstrates President Biden's enduring legacy and in public service. He has served this country in an incredible way, and I think this further demonstrates his legacy and how much he deeply loves and cares for this country.
Yeah, and I know you're a leading expert on election administration and policy, as well as political conventions. And we're just a few weeks away from the Democratic National Convention. This is going to be an interesting time. Go ahead, walk us through what will happen in the next days, the weeks ahead of the DNC for many of us who have never lived through something like this.
Yeah, well, both the RNC and the DNC have rules in place for not only how they conduct their elections, but how it works up to and leading up to a convention, and what the process for delegate engagement actually looks like. And both parties have processes in place, they have rules in place, and certainly there is a lot going on at the DNC right now as they think through what the next days and weeks ahead will look like. What I think is really important and what is very different about this is the number of unaffiliated voters and independent voters that now exists in the country. We're at about 51% nationally. We have 22 states that still have closed primary processes. So what I think is really going to be important for the DNC to think about is how they create an engaging and enduring process over the next few weeks, so that they can not only engage the delegates, but also engage all of the American people at large in a process that respects democracy, ensures democracy, respects obviously their rules and their procedures, but also creates a vehicle for the American people to have voice and have influence and have a process that engages them and creates civic enthusiasm along the way as well.
And talk about the actual convention. What will Democrats need to do at the DNC in Chicago in a couple of weeks?
Yeah, well, so the convention process obviously exists, and they have rules about how delegates engage and vote. And interestingly, and I just want to give this piece of history, on the Democratic side, there's been 15 contested or brokered or open conventions, meaning that they had to have multiple ballots or they had to have a process. And on the Republican side, there's been 9 instances of that in our history. On the Republican side, one of those brokered or contested elections was actually in 1860 when Abraham Lincoln won, and I think it actually occurred in Chicago after three rounds of ballots. On the Democratic side, one of the most significant presidents that came out of a brokered or contested election was actually FDR in 1932 after 4 ballot rounds. So this has happened before. Both parties have rules in place. They're very thoughtful about what those rules look like, and I anticipate that the DNC will be very communicative, not only with the delegates, but with the public at large about what the process will look like. And again, I just hope that it is deeply engaging, deeply thoughtful about how not only to embrace and hear from voters within the Democratic Party, but also think about what their outreach looks like for this 51% of the American public that are now unaffiliated and are going to have a big say in the outcome in November.
Yeah, you just mentioned that brokered convention. There was also one, it looks like in 1952. Talk about the historical context. It's interesting because that one was also in Chicago. This one's going to be in Chicago. Not sure if that's the situation in Chicago, is that we always have a little bit of chaos at the DNC.
They planned it.
Yeah, but talk a little bit about the historic context. I mean, this is going to go down in the history books, and how quickly things need to come together for Democrats.
Yeah, and I think the history here in particular is we've never had 51% of the country be independent, and about 60% of voters under 30 fall in that category. And we still have a lot of states that have closed primaries. So I think what's really important in the days and weeks ahead is for the DNC to be super thoughtful about how they engage delegates, how they encourage delegates to hear from constituencies around the country. And I think it could actually be historic and set a new precedent for how the parties engage with the American electorate. So to me, this is a huge opportunity for the DNC to be super innovative, super thoughtful about that engagement, super thoughtful about how to, bring different voices into the process that maybe didn't exist before, and really create the kind of civic enthusiasm that we frankly have never seen in American politics. And, so for me, I think it's just a huge opportunity that they have. At the convention itself, they will have a process like they always do for delegates to cast their ballot. And that will very much depend on what happens in the next few days in terms of which candidates. Obviously, we've already seen Vice President Harris declare that she's going to put her name in. There might be others where we're not sure what that will look like yet. But as that continues to play out in the next few days, I think it's really important that the DNC just be super thoughtful about how they communicate those rules, how they communicate that process, and how they can create maximum engagement amongst the American electorate, which would set a new precedent for how parties can engage with the electorate at large in this very important process.
And in your experience working elections and as an independent voter yourself, you feel this could be a big moment for independent voters, and explain why.
Well, so given that independent voters have been growing in margin and in veracity over the past few decades, where we're culminating at this moment where more than 51%, according to a recent Gallup assessment, is now 51% of the electorate. And so that's a first time threshold. We've never seen independents grow to be that high. And so I just think it's critically important that both parties think about how those independent voters are going to think about the election come November, but also how the parties adjust what may be their historic and normal processes to engage that very significant, very important group of electors, especially given that 60% of young people under the age of 30 are registered independent, and that's also growing. And so I just think that there's a huge opportunity here for that electorate to be engaged. They are the ones deciding a lot of elections, especially in swing states now going forward. And so, I think whichever major party figures out how best to engage that segment of the population, be super thoughtful about what their perspectives are, and be super thoughtful about how to pull those voices in, to encourage those voices to participate, will be the victors ultimately come November.
Yeah, one thing that we do know is that time is of the essence here. Talk a little bit about the time that we have left, as well as the money. So a lot of times people aren't thinking about the campaign funds that went into this election. This is essentially the whole 4 years. If you are going up for re-election, you are raising money during that time frame. Talk about where the money that the Biden administration goes now, and how quickly, if there is another Democratic nominee, if it's not Kamala Harris, how quickly that person has to raise the amount of funds that they need to go forward.
Sure. Well, and campaign finance laws are another segment of the election process that have, detailed rules and laws and regulations around them. There's obviously super PACs and political action committees that have been operating. They have a certain set of rules. The campaign itself has another set of rules. So all of the sort of rules and regulations around the money are going to matter greatly, and a lot of that's going to be worked out in the coming days. Often, when you have a presidential campaign, money is not only going from the campaign, but it's also going out to the state parties themselves for their operations and how that all plays out. So I anticipate that there will be a lot more clarity around what some of those things look like in the coming days. And I'm sure there are very smart campaign finance lawyers that are thinking about what this all means in the next few days. And certainly I've already seen a lot of communications today about how much Vice President Harris is raising and has been raising since this announcement was made, and even the Democratic Party itself. So all of those rules and regulations, again, will play out. And, again, those things are kind of one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is the actual running of the election at the convention. And so the delegates are going to need to vote. It will very much, the process itself will very much depend on how many people are in that equation with regards to running for president. And then there's also the VP selection process. And so, again, I think the more engaging, transparent, thoughtful process that can ensue is the best for the American people, because really the DNC, I think at this point, has an opportunity to create tremendous civic enthusiasm, pull more of the electorate in to see the process and be able to hear from whoever might be putting their names forward for both the presidential position, but also the vice presidential candidate. And really, this is a historic moment for sure, given that we are in a technical era too, that allows people to express their voices more quickly and more directly over social media and all of the avenues that we have that didn't exist 50 years ago when we last saw some of these more competitive conventions.
And Amber, I know you, like probably many others, probably could have saw this move coming by President Biden. But is there anything that you're particularly shocked or surprised about now that we're a couple hours into it?
Well, I actually had no idea. I'm not a member of the party. President Biden, you mentioned this at the introduction, he appointed me to be a governor for the Postal Service, which is a presidential appointee, Senate confirmed. I think I'm the first independent that was ever appointed in that role, and I was tapped for my experience, not only working with the Postal Service, but also working as an election official. So, I look at that and think, gosh, I've spent most of my career in public service and just trying to improve the process for everyone. And I thought that President Biden's announcement today really demonstrated a leadership that he has really promoted throughout his entire career in public service. It demonstrated an endearing love for this country and respect for the American people. And I really think that it's a good example of what public service should look like and what political courage should look like for others to follow and emulate. And certainly it's I think a great example for future generations, like my own kids that are 11 and 13. And, I think anytime we can see political leaders put their country first and really be thoughtful about how they see their political future and also their legacy is really important. And this will be everlasting for sure.
Yeah, we know President Biden is a prideful man, so for him to step aside and say, you know what, time is now, I'm going to pass the torch. It's definitely a big move. Amber McReynolds, election expert, thanks so much for joining us and giving us that valuable insight.
Thank you.
And of course, we've been reading these different...
And with President Biden's announcement, the move creates a vacuum in the Democratic Party with fewer than 5 months to crown a successor.
Yeah, a very short amount of time. But as politics play out on the national stage in real time, we wanted to take a look back at the events of the last 3 weeks. There have been very many of them, and how they ended up sealing the president's fate. Molly Martinez reports.
A shaky debate performance on June 27th set in motion a series of events that destabilized the Biden re-election campaign. In an effort to do immediate damage control, 1 week later, the president agreed to a sit-down interview with George Stephanopoulos.
If the Lord Almighty came down and said, Joe, get out of the race, I'll get out of the race. The Lord Almighty's not coming down.
The interview did little to quell the growing anxiety in the party, with several congressional members calling for the president to bow out.
The president of the United States doesn't have the vigor necessary to overcome the deficit.
Now, celebrities were getting involved, with friend and mega donor George Clooney penning an op-ed in the New York Times that the president was unfit to serve another term. On July 11th, following the NATO summit in Washington, D.C., the president put himself in the hot seat, hosting his first ever solo press conference in 8 months. The attempt to show off his acumen for foreign policy was eclipsed by this gaffe.
I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president.
The redemption tour continued, despite a growing chorus of members of his own party calling for a replacement. Then, the event no one could have predicted. This stunning, pivotal moment catapulted support for Donald Trump and forced many to take an even harder look, not just at Joe Biden's viability as a candidate, but the survivability of the party with important congressional and Senate races at stake. In the days after the attempted assassination, reports grew of high-ranking Democrats, including Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi and former President Barack Obama, asking for intervention. These calls were heated, with Biden announcing it's time to pass the torch. We're still a month out from the DNC, where the party faces a reckoning of identity and leadership. In Washington, I'm Molly Martinez.
And I know, as speaking of passing the torch, we now know that President Biden wants to pass that torch on to Vice President Kamala Harris. I know that you had a chance to speak one-on-one with her back in February. Talk a little bit about that.
I mean, the main question I came in there with, at that time especially was, if something were to happen to President Biden while in office, obviously we knew he was going to campaign for a second term. If something were to happen, can you fill in and take the reins? Here's her answer.
I think one of the concerns that Americans have about the age is just older people have, more health issues. It's a real thing. What do you say to those concerns? And specifically, if he had to pass the powers to you for 1 second, 1 minute, heaven forbid, and I ask with all due respect, but, are you capable? Are you ready to step into the role and do whatever the country would need?
Absolutely ready.
Absolutely ready. Those are her words, and so ready that the Federal Election Commission has already allowed her to be the official to file as a presidential nominee, potentially. What else did you kind of talk to her about? I know you had maybe about 20 minutes with her or so.
It was about 12 minutes, yeah.
12,
and we stretched that
roughly.
extra, too. Really supposed to be 10. But, the other issue that I'm sure she is going to have to answer for is immigration. She has been dubbed the border czar. I know there was confusion as she kind of clarified it for me. I said, hey, the border is an issue. You're the border czar. She said her specific role was that she was to go to a lot of these countries people are migrating from, Central America, South America, what have you, help to build up those countries, help build up those economies so people are incentivized to stay home, not come to America. I'm sure she's going to have to answer that question about 1,000 times if she hasn't already, along with a lot of other things like the economy and some of the other things, especially when you look at, just things that are happening across the country that people are upset about.
Yeah, Vice President Kamala Harris, now a Democratic candidate. And in North Carolina, our station WBTV, they reached out to former Governor Pat McCrory. He says he was expecting President Biden to make this decision.
I'm going to unmute everything.
Not run again. I will not accept my nomination. Doing it by letter is maybe another signal that he's not ready to go on TV that much more. So I think it was a smart move for the Democrats, and it's probably the only chance the Democrats have to win the presidential race. And I assume they're worried about Senate and House seats too.
Yeah, all those concerns definitely top of mind. Politicians and voters. And after weeks of speculation and insisting he would not back out, President Joe Biden today about 1:45 this afternoon making a historic
What is happening? That's so weird.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me here at the First Alert Breaking News Desk. My name is Tori Cooper, and I'm joined here with Maria Moreau.
Good to be with you, Tori. Such unprecedented news. A lot of chatter was going on for several weeks about President Biden possibly announcing that he would be exiting this race, and now from the president himself at about 1:46 today, making that announcement in a letter that he posted across social media. And I think we have that letter that we can show to you. But basically saying that he had every intention of running against the Republican candidate nominee now, former President Donald Trump, but that after careful thought and several conversations, he decided that it wasn't in the best interest. And, he didn't specifically endorse Kamala Harris in this letter that he initially posted, but he did, I believe, half an hour later in a separate post on social media say that his recommendation is to go with Vice President Kamala Harris for the Democratic nomination.
Yeah, he moved forward on that. He posted on his Instagram page saying that he was one of the best decisions he ever made was picking Vice President Kamala Harris. And he says, it's time now to unite the country and to come together and beat former President Donald Trump. He's really making his best effort to unite Democrats behind a new nominee. So a lot still has to happen for the nominee. As we know, this is not final. There's a lot of questions that are still moving through this process about where the campaign funds will go, what has to happen in order to get her name on this ticket. And then, of course, we have the DNC coming up, which is going to be a big pivotal moment for the Democratic Party, because at that point, she still has to get over 4,000 delegates within a span of just a number of days, because that's going to take place, I believe, on August 19th, yes, in Chicago. And that's going to carry on for the number of days. And this comes on the heels of the RNC, which, we know that the GOP is, has a lot of momentum right now. And we've already seen former President Donald Trump chiming in with some comments on this already. I want to just bring that into the picture really quick, because we're going to get to some of the other responses that we've seen from political leaders on the Democratic side. But this was definitely what we heard from Donald Trump. So I'm just going to read a few pieces of what he said. It's most of the information is stuff you would expect. He mentioned that, crooked Joe Biden is the worst president by far in the history of our nation. He has done everything possible to destroy our country, from our southern border to energy dominance, national security, international standing, and so much more. He was alienated in an earth-shattering debate, and now the corrupt and radical Democrats are throwing him overboard. He was not fit to serve from the very beginning, but the people around him lied to America about this complete and total mental, physical, and cognitive demise. Whoever the left puts up now will just be more of the same. Make America great again. And Maria, I'm sure you know this. I mean, this has been the big statement today from the Trump administration, is that nothing's changing here. You're still going to get the same person, the same Democrats that we've seen in office the last 4 years. So this is definitely moving through. We're starting to see a lot more responses. And of course, the Trump administration is already plotting their next move. They did talk about the fact that they're pulling out of the debate that was scheduled to take place in September.
Yeah, let's talk about what a week former President Donald Trump has had for a minute.
Yeah,
last Sunday, Tori, he
but we're going to make our country more successful than ever before. Yet even
what
as we gather this
an
evening, we will
attempt.
and take a look. Still, the Democratic
had a
nominee.
moment where
We're going to find
went
out.
up to the cameras and he held his fist in the air and he said, "Fight, fight, fight." And that was a moment for him, although I'm sure terrifying, that he has talked about with almost a point of pride, having that happen to him. A lot of eyes, a lot of heartbreak and support was expressed to him from many of the people who have followed him since he started to enter the presidential space. And then we talk about the RNC week, and anytime you have the RNC or the DNC, there is always a slight increase in polling among voters for that specific nominee and candidate. they are performing a little bit higher following that week that they are, nominated and celebrated, and that is what we are seeing with former President Donald Trump. So now to see that his rival, his primary focus for this year, Joe Biden, he has laser focused his attention on, is dropping out after weeks of speculation if it was going to happen. I mean, for Donald Trump, this is an ideal place to be in.
It really is, and our apologies for the sound that was playing in the beginning of your statements there, Maria. But you did mention, Maria, about the polling that we have been keeping a close eye on. And even though this poll that I'm going to show right now, I'm just going to make sure it loops through, you can see that the early voters, the likely voters that were surveyed in this poll, not too recent, but this is the latest poll that we have from likely voters. And it shows that if Kamala Harris and Donald Trump were to face each other, and that was the matchup, she has 48% and Donald Trump has 51%. But both times this margin of error has been, something that is very critical and potentially, going to be a very tight race if she does in fact get the nomination.
And to that extent, Kamala Harris saying, in response to Biden's endorsement, that she plans to earn and win this nomination. And those are very important words that we want to use, is earn and win, as the vice president said. And that is because it is not a done deal just because the president supports her candidacy and encourages the delegates to vote for her. This is what I believe just over 4,600 delegates, nearly 4,700 delegates that have to rally around the vice president on a quick turnaround, by the way, ahead of August 19th, I believe it was, August 16th.
19th, you had it correct.
19th,
it was,
August
yes.
19th, the DNC week starting, and that is a big ask for all of those delegates to rally around her. But that's what we saw with Biden. Biden had an really unchallenged primary that he saw. I believe his Democratic contenders only had about 3 to 5 delegates compared to the rest that went to Biden. So it could easily has transferred to Harris, but that is going to depend on how well the Democratic Party can really get together and express that unity. And there's that quote from the vice president: "I'm honored to have the president's endorsement, and my intention is to earn and win this nomination." Those are the words that she's going forward with.
Yeah, and Biden won every state primary and caucus and only lost to the territory of American Samoa, I should say. And at least 3,800 delegates had been pledged to support him. The current party rules, however, don't permit Biden to pass the delegates to another candidate, but his endorsement is likely to be influential in all of this, especially at the DNC. So we will have to wait and see if she does manage to drive up the support that she can get, and what will happen to the people who already set out to vote for former president, or to vote for President Joe Biden. And then there's also the other question about where do these campaign funds go, because there's millions of dollars that have been raised for the Democratic Party, but because her name is on the ticket as well, that's been another big factor here, because technically they both were on the same ticket. So the funds can go to her, but it could become a little tricky still. And it will be interesting to see if the GOP tries to jump in with possible litigation to try to prevent Kamala Harris from becoming the nominee. There's still a lot at play here that could still happen, and we're starting to just hear each minute by minute. We're getting new updates from both sides.
And
so.
We spoke with a political expert during all the speculation surrounding President Biden, whether he was going to drop out or not, and it was brought up what happens to the donations that he has, garnered over his campaigning efforts. Current law allows that money, that Kamala Harris, if she becomes a nominee, to pull from that money because her name is already on the ticket. Now, if it went to another nominee, essentially, they would have to start from scratch. They cannot just tap into those donation funds or that campaign money. They would have to find another way, or at least, try to catch up as quickly as they can ahead of November. The other point you bring up, Tori, is a great point. I'm sure President Trump has already thought with his team, what legal actions can we take in this unprecedented move on Biden's part, and I'm sure we'll see that come out in one way or another. We'll follow that closely. But yeah, the constitutional law surrounding all of this, we have not seen this happen in quite a while in this way.
We're gonna
So it's exciting to follow.
Yeah, and we're going to see it play out really soon here. I mean, talk about a week for news. Last weekend, there was the attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump. And then this weekend, we're now sitting here talking about our current sitting president stepping aside and endorsing his vice presidential pick for president. So this has been an insane week in news, and now we're heading into the DNC on August 19th. That's really where all eyes are focused now, because that's when we're really going to see the momentum that Kamala Harris may or may not have as we head into this, as it relates to her party. And there have been other names that have been uttered in terms of who may be a better presidential nominee. We've heard Governor Gavin Newsom from California. We've also heard the name, the Michigan governor as well. I have her name right here, Gretchen Whitmer. She's also been named as someone who could be a strong pick. And, there's a lot riding on this. I was briefly talking about this with our colleagues about how each party really has their strong points. Republicans really are aiming forward with immigration. That's their strong push this time around, as well as, Kamala Harris is going to have abortion on her side. But as we head into the DNC, we do have our political reporter, Doug Reardon, who has just returned from Milwaukee. If you've been, I know, poor Doug. Doug has been everywhere, from a car to sleepless nights, to bring us this coverage of the RNC, and he just made it back about 12 hours ago. But he did manage to put together a story for you tonight to really walk you through what's being talked about and discussed in terms of the DNC. So we're going to let him take it from here. And Maria, I'm going to push this volume button up, right?
Yep.
That's the right one?
That's correct.
Maria is our star, and I mean, she knows everything when it comes to running this show, this side of the show. So we're going to let Doug pick it up from here.
The total initiative relative to what we're going to do with more Border Patrol.
It all started right here in Atlanta.
President Trump?
I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence.
With a poor debate performance that weeks later has shaken up the race for president.
Well, it's a black swan event.
Dr. Ben Taylor with Kennesaw State University says delegates already pledged to Joe Biden through primaries and caucuses don't automatically belong to presumptive nominee Vice President Kamala Harris. She still has to earn them.
Now they will be open, the process will be opened up, and they will be able to vote their conscience.
That nominating process will happen at next month's Democratic National Convention. Ahead of that, there could be a series of town halls or meetings with delegates to shore up support for Harris. The VP, who's made half a dozen stops to Georgia since the beginning of the year, may have Republicans on their heels. She's a vastly different candidate than Biden, and the central question of age doesn't work for the GOP anymore.
They will have to go back to the drawing board on that. They will have to go back to the drawing board on their entire strategy in some sense.
This is the latest a sitting president has dropped out of a race, and with less than 1 month until their convention and only 4 months until the election for Democrats.
Whatever happens has to happen very quickly.
The total initiative relative to what we're going to do with more Border Patrol.
So
Little technical hiccup there.
Little technical hiccup there, but a lot still at stake with this Democratic National Convention coming up in just, a matter of weeks. So we're going to be keeping a close eye on everything that transpires there. But we do also just want to talk a little bit about some of the other responses that we are getting from other leaders here in Georgia, and Kamala Harris and her push to really get Georgia on her side, and not just her side, but President Joe Biden's side. I mean, just within this year so far, she has been to Georgia 5 different times. And I just want to walk through some of what she's done during her time here. In February, she was here and she was part of a discussion at Georgia Tech where she talked about combating climate change and really pushing forward with clean energy. And then she was back here in April, and she went to Georgia Tech again, and she was talking about she was backing 2 companies, major energy companies that were going to put millions of dollars into, solar panels. And then she also toured a manufacturing facility for solar panels to also bring that to people of Georgia. And this was all part of the Invest in America tour that both her and President Joe Biden were doing at the time. And then in June, she was here, which is just, last month, she was here for a gun violence summit with rapper Quavo. And, that was a big shock to the Atlanta community when Takeoff, who was friends with Quavo, the rapper, both rappers were close, but Takeoff was unfortunately murdered. And so that, hit close to the rapper Quavo as well as the entire music industry. So gun violence was the spotlight of that issue. And she partnered with Quavo to really share remarks about gun violence and trying to, advocate for change in our community for that. And that was all during Juneteenth. So we've seen her here in Georgia, making her a lot. We've seen her here in Georgia a lot. But I know that you wanted to talk a little bit about some of the other responses we got, so I'm going to bring that in. Let's talk about Stacey Abrams, if you would like. I'm going to cut to that just so that we can, Stacey Abrams is a powerhouse in our community and always has a strong voice. So I'm going to let you read what she said there.
Yeah,
Maria.
talk about Stacey Abrams, who was not in the political light here in Georgia not too long ago, saying in reaction to Biden's letter that he penned announcing his exit from the presidential race, quote, "Throughout his career, Joe Biden has shown resilience and a deep belief in the power of unity and democracy. His steadfast stewardship will continue to inspire us as we move forward to build a better America. Now more than ever, we must not only unite to ensure that Donald Trump does not return to the White House, we must champion a vibrant vision for our next American chapter."
Yeah.
Now, she goes on to say, "It is our responsibility to lift every voice and pick up the mantle and fight for justice, equality, and democracy. Let's rally together and show the world the strength and resilience of our democracy. Together, we will build a brighter future for all." I just wanted to note, the common message that we were seeing from all of these reactions was the Democratic Party's message about unity. That is going to be big for them, is to encourage people to have unity or have a sense of unity and rally behind the inevitable nominee.
Yeah, and she's not the only Georgia politician that we're hearing from. I mean, they all poured in today. We can talk about former Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms releasing her statement and, again, having a really thoughtful approach in the way she talked about her relationship working with President Joe Biden and what this means to the party. Everyone is really saying that, he put America first when he made this decision to step back and push forward with Kamala Harris in his place. And I mean, let's just pull out a small part of this. I remember pointing to part of it. She talked about, in the midst of all the discussions the past few weeks, President Biden took time to call me a couple of days ago to tell me that he loved and appreciated me and to thank me for all I have done for him. He has faced adversity with courage and resilience, always prioritizing the well-being of others, his ability to connect with people from all walks of life, and his unwavering belief in the goodness of humanity have been a source of inspiration for me and countless others. I mean, so many people have humanized Joe Biden in this moment. So many people have talked about what it's been like to work with him in the White House, and they've talked about some of his accomplishments. And President Joe Biden himself also talked about some of those accomplishments. And I'm going to draw the attention to that part of his statement. In this paragraph you see right here, his very first paragraph, he goes in to talk about some of the major accomplishments of his administration so far. He said, "America has the strongest economy in the world. We've made historic investments in rebuilding our nation and lowering prescription drug costs for seniors, and in expanding affordable health care to a record number of Americans. We've provided critically needed care to 1 million veterans exposed to toxic substances, passed the first gun safety law in 30 years, appointed the first African-American woman to the Supreme Court, and passed the most significant climate legislation in the history of the world. America has never been in a better position to lead than we are today." And, when you hear what he's leaving as he moves into this next phase, I mean, amazing accomplishments that he really wants voters to know. And this was in tandem with his partner as Vice President, Kamala Harris.
Yeah, being on the digital side of things, seeing the reaction pour out to this letter, to Biden's announcement, and then reading through about his legacy and looking back, he was a career politician. He was well liked in his prime days by both parties. I won't say like across the board, of course, but he did have a good pull in his I would say 30s, 40s, going into his 50s. This wasn't a conversation around whether Joe Biden was liked as a human or not. Right. It was concerns over his age. He is the oldest living president to be actively serving. I believe he's the oldest president to this age that he's in, I think he's 81 years old at this point, to see the decline that people have raised concerns about. And that has obviously been very clear with the American people. His polling is at the lowest that it's ever been. People have genuine concerns, or had genuine concerns, while he was in the running for re-election, whether he would come out on top. You know, a lot of people expressing their concern over having a strong Democratic candidate going up against a former president as influential as Donald Trump.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, whether or not he would be able to move on into the White House for a second term, given his current age and possibly health concerns. And as we talk about this, I mean, the president is also dealing with a COVID diagnosis that he just endured. So, you know, we know that he's bring this down a little bit. But we know that, you know, Biden was diagnosed with COVID and he was at his home in Maryland recovering. And, you know, talk about horrible timing when the conversation is about your health and your longevity and how able you are to, you know, resume the office of, you know, commander-in-chief, and then you get diagnosed with COVID. You know, it hasn't been an easy week for President Joe Biden, hasn't been an easy 2 weeks for President Joe Biden, and it's going to be top of mind. I mean, whether this is what this next phase looks like for him. So, you know, there's a lot of different issues on the table right now about not only his health, but, you know, how this is going to relate to Kamala Harris. The focus now is on Kamala Harris and what she does. And, you know, when you talk about Kamala Harris, I mean, her background is nothing short of exceptional. You know, she's a former prosecutor out of California that was, you know, very, very popular. She's worked I'm just trying to bring up some video of Kamala Harris. Here we go. This is some video of her as we talk about her here. But I mean, she's been a successful prosecutor. You know, when it comes to a debate, you know, many people on both sides have their perspectives on how that would go between her and Donald Trump. But we also saw Donald Trump's team already saying that they're pulling out of a debate and they don't want to be in that same arena with her, and you can imagine why. I mean, this is someone who went to school for this, has been a very skillful prosecutor, and knows exactly how to be in a debate stage. So it'll be interesting to see when these two potentially end up in the same room. But one of the main things is, you know, one of the chatter around Kamala Harris is that she's a fierce competitor and that she would be the first African-American woman as president, and that has meaning of its own because we know that historically, black women have come out in droves in much higher numbers than other Americans, and especially this time around, the black voters has been the target for both campaigns, and this will definitely be a strong moment for the Democratic Party if they do move forward with a African-American woman as their nominee.
And, you know, we talk about Kamala Harris as the nominee simply because at this point, Biden is endorsing that she become the nominee. She has not been chosen at this point. She has not solidified this future for herself. That will all come out in mid to late August with the Democratic National Convention. But it's not unfair to say that a sitting president endorsing his vice president for the ticket to essentially carry the mantle has heavy influence and is a signal to the rest of the Democratic Party to fall in line and get behind her. And it will be up to the party to decide if they do want to stand behind the president on this or if they want to go another way. There are a couple other names that come up because
I'm going to play that really quick with the other vice presidential picks. Not, or we're going to show the other people who they were saying. You know, we were talking about Governor Gavin Newsom, and there's a little. I'm sure you have a better idea of where that video is, so that we can show this while we talk about it, about some of the other candidates that people have been uttering in terms of who would be a good pick.
I'll start with this. If it is Vice President Kamala Harris.
Yes.
There was a lot of question around, well, who is going to be her vice presidential pick? So we'll start with this, and then we'll talk about the other nominees. One of the big things that stand out to us, just because we're local news here in Georgia, the name Reverend Raphael Warnock, Georgia sitting senator, well liked in the community. He just won his re-election bid, one that caught a lot of national attention, I might add. So he's in the running. We have Pete Buttigieg, which is a name that has been on top of people's minds since the 2016, I believe, or 2020 presidential election when he threw his hat in the ring. The current transportation secretary could possibly be a vice presidential pick. I think we have a handful of governors also on that list, and some of those governors actually being discussed as the possible nominee if the party decides not to go with Kamala Harris, if the delegates don't rally behind her. Some of those being the governor of
California.
The governor of California, Gavin Newsom, would be a popular one. Governor Gretchen of Michigan, Governor J.B. Pritzker of Illinois. One name that a lot of people have heard because, again, she has been in politics for quite some time. Amy Klobuchar, a senator from Minnesota, and Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania was an early name when we were talking about Biden's reelection before he entered the primaries and got that support from his delegates, from the party's delegates. So a couple names still being circled around and will be discussed, but make no mistake, Vice President Kamala Harris is in for really a microscope on her life and her time as a politician, and even you mentioned earlier as a criminal prosecutor, she did face some backlash over her stances on drug convictions and other things that she did as a prosecutor that will now follow her and reemerge in the media.
Yeah, they're definitely going to go hard against Kamala Harris and her time as a prosecutor, because that came out even when she was running for vice president. And when we talk about some of her possible picks, and we keep it local in a sense of the people that have big notoriety here at home, you know, Senator Warnock, we did reach out to his team. You know, that's always the first thing that we want to do. We want to make sure that we're reaching out to anybody here locally to try to get responses from both sides. And we did reach out to Senator Warnock's team today. He said that, you know, they told us that he wasn't available for interviews because he was in Savannah, and that he is going to be holding a press conference open to reporters tomorrow in Savannah, where he will accept questions from the media. And that's really when we're going to hear from Senator Warnock, we imagine, for the first time, because so far we haven't seen him take to social media to respond to his name being, you know, in the hat for all of this. So it's going to be interesting to see what he says, and it's going to be interesting to see what Pete Buttigieg has to say about this. And both of these people are, you know, big names in our community, and people, you know, they would have Georgia's support.
And let's not forget, they are also a big part of the Democratic Party. So there is a pressure internally, especially for Pete Buttigieg, who is actively serving under President Biden and Vice President Harris as a transportation secretary. How does he handle his name being brought up as a vice presidential hopeful, or even as a presidential nominee name, while also endorsing and expressing his unity and that message by the Biden-Harris campaign? It's a weird spot to be in, and one that we'll continue to navigate. Tori, you and I wanted to hop on here to catch people up because we're plugged into the news, but not everybody is. I think we're going to do these updates for you on all of the reaction and news that comes in over the next few hours. And of course, we have continuing coverage on Atlanta News First that Tori Cooper, we will see you on air as well with continuing coverage of this.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us here on the First Alert Desk. We love sharing the updates that we're getting into our newsroom minute by minute, and this is a developing story, so we're going to get more updates, and you are going to be able to hear from Carly Barnett later on this evening, along with Blair Miller. They're going to be back up here with more updates for you on this major story that we're covering this evening. All right, well, enjoy the rest of your night.